Okay. So welcome everyone for the MyoChallenge workshop at MyoSymposium2022. So this workshop have some exciting speaker lineup. So we have Wendy Murray from Northwestern University, Thomas Katzenberg from Delft University of Technology, Alexander Mattis from EPFL, and Alessandro Del Vecchio from FIU. We will also have some talk from the challenge winner teams. So we'll have some talk from Irang Riang and Boshihan from the Pekumar team. Also Raoul Siripahu from ERRI GQ team, and Nishat Patel from the Steve Finger team. So the agenda of the workshop. So first we will have an introduction on MyoSuit, which is a framework that was used for the MyoChallenge. So that will be a talk presented by Huawei Wang, one of the organizers of the challenge. Then we will have the MyoChallenge results and future presentation presented by Vittorio Caggiano, also an organizer of the challenge. Then we will have our first invited speaker, Thomas Katzenberg. Then we will have a talk from Alexander Mattis. Then, if we have time, we'll have a short break, followed by our third speaker, Alessandro Del Vecchio. And finally, our final speaker, Wendy Murray. Then we will have a short presentation from the winner of the bowling ball challenge, and then a break, and a talk from the winner of the die rotation team. So Pekumar with Irang Yang and Boshihan, and Raoul Siripahu. And finally, we will have a panel discussion with the invited speaker and some of the organizers of the challenge and creator of the MyoSuit. So we want to thank our sponsor from the MyoChallenge. So the Digital Society Institute from the University of Twente, as well as the TechMed Center, also from the University of Twente, and Google Cloud. So the organizer of the MyoChallenge are presented here. So some of us are here, yeah. So now we will start with our first speaker, Huawei Wang, that will present the MyoSuit.
Okay, let me share my screen. Okay, can you see my screen? Yes, okay. Yeah, as Guillaume introduced, I'm a member of the MyoSuit framework. So in this a few slides, I will briefly introduce what is MyoSuit and why we are developing this framework. So our main major interest is to understand how we, as humans, achieve movement tasks. There are two layers of intelligence that involved in this. The first layer is recognitive decision making. Another layer is how we convert these decisions into motor commands, and also then execute this motor command in our musculoskeletal system. And here, the motor control part is also like considered as an intelligent system, mainly because the highly complexity of musculoskeletal systems, and also the variety of tasks we can achieve within our body system. And as for now, I guess there's not possible actually to use any equations to describe the system. And give one example. For example, our body is overactivated with muscle activators, and there are cases that multiple muscle control one joint, as well as the cases that one muscle wrapping over multiple joints. And also for muscle activator itself, it can only generating pulling force, and also the forces they generated not only depends on the neural excitations, but also depends on its length, velocity, and also the history loads. So with this, for us, we want to actually to understand these two layers of intelligent system into one framework. That's why we create a MyoSuite. On one hand, we think that the traditional biomechanical methods that studied motor control are not scalable enough to understand the cognitive decision making. On another hand, the machine learning algorithms, even though very powerful, are not very well connected to the musculoskeletal system in current phase. So that's why the MyoSuite framework is created, trying to fill the gap in between these two, let's say, fields. So in the MyoSuite framework, we have developed musculoskeletal models that is up to 4,000 faster than the OpenSim models and still maintain highly physiological accuracy. And also in the MyoSuite framework, the model has rich interaction features, which enable us to simulate real-life tasks, for example, turning the keys, and also doing co-simulations with mechanical devices. And lastly, in the MyoSuite framework, it is adapted to the GYM reinforcement learning framework for easy to use. In our current MyoSuite framework, we have developed several musculoskeletal models, and also we explored many tasks, such as motion tasks, such as the tasks that we introduced in the MyoChallenge, as well as co-simulation with exoskeleton at elbow, and also the standing balance, as you see in the video. And in the short stage goal, in next year, we would like to develop a full body musculoskeletal model, and also design rich task benchmark so that we can explore the two layers of intelligent system into one framework. And for more information of the MyoSuite, you can check our webpage. And also you can actually install the MyoSuite package directly via pep install. And without further taking everyone's time, I will hand the stage to Vittorio, talking about the detail of MyoChallenge.
Thank you, Wally. Okay, so I will cover the challenge, the details of the challenge. So let me start where Wally ended. MyoSuite has a variety of tasks, and when we train agents to solve those tasks, we found that we can achieve really good success in fixed target. But when we challenge the system with a random target, more generalizable condition, we see a drop of performance, passing from 100% to 25%. This is the motivation to start the challenge. Can we bring together the best scientists around to compete and find solutions that generalize? So what we did is to use the Myo hand as part of the MyoSuite, and that is a hand that is composed by 23 joints controlled by 39 muscle, and give information about those hands with the objects and challenge agents to solve those tasks through control of the muscle of this biomechanic hand. The tasks that we propose are two. One is about single object track that the die rotation task, where the objective is to rotate the die to achieve a specific orientation, a specific phase. And the double object track the objective is to coordinate the movement of two balls in one hand in order to rotate them. This is the bowing ball task. Now, of course, we care about success in terms of achieving the objective, that is the rotation of the balls or the rotation of the dial given rotation, but also care to make it realistic in terms that muscle needs to be minimized. We look into the effort, to minimize the effort of the solution that are both extremely important components on physiological realistic manipulations to prevent fatigue or other stress to the musculoskeletal system. We divide the challenge in two phases. In the first phase, since those tasks are new, we challenge the deterministic task where there is a limited variations that the objective have, and there are fixed rotation, for example, of the bowing balls related to each other. This phase lasts 11 weeks. Then the next phase, we really look into the generalization through randomization of the physical characteristic, randomization of the initial and goal conditions, and for example, in the bowing ball task, changing also the relative orientation clockwise or counterclockwise. This only lasts 2 weeks and was an intense phase for the challenge. Now, we had 40 participants that were subscribed to the challenge, and they came from more than 10 universities according to university affiliations, and you can see a geographic distribution on this slide. And over the 2 phases, we had more than 340 submissions with that were powered by more than 2,500 downloads of my suite. That was really the engine that's used for this challenge. Now, for the die task, we had in the phase 1 with a fixed condition, teams achieving more than 70% of success with a relatively low effort. But during the phase 2, the success dropped to 13%. And this to highlight the fact that indeed the challenges were more difficult in the generalized condition. Now we had 2 teams that pair up in achieving this high score, this score of 13%. And we ran offline from the leaderboard an extensive evaluation of many more random seed and horizons. And we found that these 2 teams that were not different in terms of statistically different in terms of solutions. Hence, we declare that for this year, the die rotation task, we had 2 co-winners, the team P. Kumar and the team Yarai JQ. And today we hear from Iran and Boshi from the team P. Kumar about their solution, and Rahul representing the team Yarai JQ. Also, we had the opportunity to meet some of the participants in person last week during the poster session, and it was really great to get to know them in person or representative for the team that were joining the poster session. For the bowing balls, we got actually even higher score. In the phase 1, we had a team that reached 100% with a very low effort. It was really impressive to see a very good solution for this task. And the same teams reached a drop performance in the phase 2, reaching only 55%. Now, this is still a really big achievement because the complexity of the task is very, very high, and we're really impressed by the team. This team is the team Steve Finkers, and Nishit today will present their solution. And a good representation of the team was present last week in New Orleans. We want also to give a special mention to the team AL for Muscles. This team managed to achieve more than 90% success in the bowing balls in the very first week of the challenge. They ended up second in the overall, but they really did an impressive competition. They were really tied up until the very end with the winning team, Steve Fingers. Now for next year, we would like to extend the MyoChallenge, and we look for feedback from you. Please reach out, give us your opinion, what you like, what you dislike. We are looking for ideas, what to bring in, to bring more manipulation, like manual manipulation, or even look for lower limbs tasks. So open to feedback, please reach out and share with us what are your preferences. And I want to conclude thanking our sponsors, generous sponsors, both for prizes and computing, and the organizers. And I want to leave you with all the references for the future. Didier, back to you.
Thank you, Vittorio. So now we will have our first speaker, Thomas Rittenberg. So Thomas Rittenberg obtained his PhD at the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands in 2013. After which he became a lead software developer at Motec Medical, a company specialized in virtual reality equipment. He is now a guest researcher at Delft University of Technology, also in the Netherlands, and he's also the founder of Godstream, a company specialized in high-performance biomechanical simulation. So he developed the open source software SCONE, and he also developed iFED, a software for high-performance biomechanical simulation. He received a Veni grant for the NWO agency in the Netherlands, and the title of his talk is going to be how to make biomechanical constraint work in your favor. So Thomas, you can share your screen and you can start.
Thank you for the introduction. Can you see the screen? Everything is working. Can you hear me also? I can't hear any one of you.
Yes, we can hear you well.
Okay, that's great. Okay, thank you. So yes, so my name is, it's very hard to pronounce. It's Thomas Geitenbeek. Sorry about it. I can't help it. I didn't come up with it. Anyway, I believe like many of you, I don't have a background in biomechanics. Instead, I started off as a computer scientist, and I studied artificial intelligence. And after my master's degree, I worked as a software developer, like you mentioned in the introduction. And at some point, I thought it was time for a new challenge. So I decided I wanted to do something else. And I was always inspired by the virtual creature evolution simulations by Carl Sims. And I wanted to do something similar like that. So I started a PhD, ended up creating my own virtual creature simulations. Had a lot of fun doing that. And during that research, I actually discovered that muscles are actually really efficient actuators that can create very natural looking motions. So I wanted to learn more about that. And because of that, I started a postdoc at Delft University with a goal to better understand how humans move and to see if we can use those predictive simulations for more clinical applications. One of the things I developed there was SCONE, which is an open source software framework for predictive simulations. During that research, I've been using OpenSim mainly for the simulations, but as the optimization became more complex, I became increasingly held back by the slow simulation speed. And so after my postdoc ended, I made a big step and started my own company and developed my own musculoskeletal or biomechanical simulation software, which I ended up naming HyperDye. And so far it's quite successful. It's a lot faster than OpenSim as well. And it's slowly being adapted by the biomechanics community. So that's the introduction. Now for the main talk. So the musculoskeletal and nervous system have been evolving together for more than 500 million years. It's really amazing to think about it. And during that time, they've always both served a single purpose, which is to generate useful motion. So the only reason we have a nervous system with a brain is so that it can generate muscle activation patterns. Because of that, it only makes sense that muscles have been evolved to support the nervous system in this task and to actually make it the control task as easy as possible instead of making it more difficult. So in this talk, I try to show a couple of examples of how that's possible. So first of all, there's muscle geometry. Muscles are attached to bones, and when they contract, they produce torque around one or more joints, which causes the bodies to rotate. Now, the amount of torque really depends on where the muscles are attached to the bodies. So if the muscles are very far away from the joint, then the moment arm is very large and the muscles generate a lot of torque, but the range of motion is very limited. as you can see here, their muscles are activated alternatively, like one at a time. So if you make the muscle moment arm very small instead, then you can see that the range of motion is much larger, but the torque that's generated is much smaller. So there's a trade-off in that for where muscles are located. Now, if you slightly change the positions of those muscle attachments in 3D, so off plane, so the previous one were all on the same plane, the attachments, but if you change those only slightly and you use the same activation pattern, and you'll see that all of a sudden there's this complex motion that's being generated. So it's really an interesting phenomenon. And in our research, we tried to see if we could use that phenomenon to optimize the muscle attachment positions for characters with sort of extreme dimensions. And you can see on the left side, the original attachment is just scaled, and on the right, it's re-optimized, and you can see that the motion is much better if you optimize it. So that really shows that that having a good muscle geometry or efficient attachment really simplifies the control problem, because the simple controller couldn't really find any solutions if the attachments weren't optimized. So another important aspect is muscle force. This could be a whole separate presentation, so I'm just going to highlight two elements. First of all, the force-velocity relationship, or the active force-velocity relationship. It's often seen as a constraint, but it actually is a very important feature of a muscle, because it allows co-contraction, and that's one of the main things that you can do to make your posture more rigid. If you activate all muscles on both sides of the joints, then it really is hard to move the bodies, and that's only because of the active force relationship. So that basically means that if your muscle lengthens, then it produces a lot more force than if it shortens, and therefore, without needing any additional control, you can control the stiffness of your joints, basically. Another important aspect is tendon elasticity. That's especially important during gait, where the energy is stored, kinetic energy is stored inside the tendon and released after, to minimize the amount of work that needs to be done by the muscles. And it's also important for mechanical damping in some cases. And it's actually still ongoing research on what the function is of tendons, but new functions are being discovered still. So here's a quick side note on muscle models. To simulate them, you really need small step sizes, small integration step sizes. And I did sort of a little check, not to be too critical on the MyoChallenge, but if you simulate it with a step size that's too large, so like 500 Hertz, I think the MyoChallenge was, you can see that the muscle velocity really becomes really spiky. So it changes a lot from each frame to the other. And that's something you really have to watch out for if your step size is too large, because this is something that I've seen that will be exploited by a controller, because it will actually change the force velocity relationship, because it can do something like this. So this is something to watch out for, and you basically need around, well, a lot smaller step size than this to get an accurate simulation most of the time. So another step is that muscles are another important aspect of muscles, that they're also sensors. The two most important muscle sensors are the Golgi tendon organ, which measures force, and the muscle spindle, which measures length and velocity. And these two also play in part in combination with the geometry. So the way they are attached also provide meaningful signals. Finally, there's neural delays, something you don't have to worry about with as a robotics researcher, but in humans, there's a significant delays for each muscle depending on the distance from the spine, basically from the spinal cord, and the amount of processing that needs to be done. And all these elements that I discussed, like the main The main point I'm trying to make is that all these elements together have been evolving together, so they're also optimized to work well together. And to demonstrate that, I'm going to do a little demo with a bunch of simulations with a very simple neural network. So this is the most basic neural network you can imagine. It's only for each muscle, there's only two inputs. There's a force and a length input and a single output. And the inputs are directly connected to the output and only connected to one other muscle, which is the muscle with the opposite action, so the antagonistic muscle. So there's like 4 weights and 1 bias for each muscle. So it's the most simple network you can imagine. There's no hidden nodes. And if you simulate it with the initial weights and biases, you will get something like this. So this is fixed by the head, but you will see that there's like a sort of, I don't know, like a movement pattern that automatically is generated. But if you optimize it, then, for instance, if you optimize it for height, then you can see that immediately it will discover this sort of jumping behavior. If you optimize it to move backwards, you can see that it generates a backwards hop. And if you optimize to move forwards, and this is actually really one of the most amazing results, I thought. So it's the same simple neural network, and we just change the initial position a little bit and optimize the weights to move forwards. And if you do that, you can see a very naturalistic gait pattern emerges with just those 2 elements. So here's again in slow motion, so you can see it. And there have been much more complex control strategies that fail to generate such a natural motion. So that's really interesting, I think. And also sometimes it will find something else. So it can also do a hopping forward, just depending on which direction the optimizer decides to go. And to prove the point that all these components are connected together, here are some results where I tried to optimize it, but took out so on the left side, you can see the same optimization, but without neural delays. So the neural delays have been removed, and then you can see all of a sudden it doesn't work anymore. So the forward gate doesn't appear, and this is really the best it can do for out of a whole bunch of optimizations. This was the best result. Same thing if you remove the elastic tendon and add a rigid tendon instead, also the entire thing falls apart, and the natural gate that we saw earlier just doesn't get discovered anymore. It's not possible with the simple controller, and you suddenly need a much more complicated control system. So finally, here's a cycling simulation just to show something else. The interesting thing about this is that it can just start from 0 to a specific speed, just with one bunch of reflexes, one set of fixed weights. So that's the power of this basic neural network. And the really interesting avenue you could take with this network is of course that you would build a high-level control neural network on top of that. So I think this is really an interesting thing to see in the future, that you have these basic connections and then try to build more complexity on top of that instead of building the whole complexity, whole complex control neural network at once. I've been doing a little bit of research about that with just a little bit more neurons, and it can do already a lot more, but it's still not nearly as close as to what you could do with a real machine learning or a real deep neural network. So it's really interesting to see what's possible with that. So here's a final thing on the controller. So for the gate controller, I developed the HiFi software, and it makes the optimization just run a lot more fast than with OpenSim. Finally, here's a comparison slide between the different simulation engines. So I suppose that machine learning researchers now use MyoChallenge, which doesn't have that muscle dynamics model, doesn't have a variable or elastic tendon, and also the contact force is a little different. So it's really the goal of HiFi was really to match the accuracy of OpenSim, but with a speed, with a much higher speed than that. That's it. that's my talk. I hope it was on time.
Yes, thanks a lot, Thomas. Very interesting. So we have time for a couple of questions. So if there is any question. Yes, Huawei?
Yeah, okay. Thanks for the nice presentation. It's very interesting. So I'm wondering about the delay. So how do you think why, like if you remove delay, then the motion is not, well, it's not able to generate a stable motion anymore. But in the, let's say the classical control theory that if there's no delay, it's much easier to control a system.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and it's also not very well understood. But one of the things, for instance, is that if you have the tibialis anterior muscle, so the shin muscle, during push off, what you want is actually you want to push off, and then at the beginning of swing you want it to contract again, so that it lifts the foot and clears for ground clearance. But actually, it's positioned in such a way that if you generate that activation with just a stretch reflex, and you do it a little bit later because of the neural delay, the timing is exactly right. So the idea is that the position of the muscle, the way the reflex works, everything has evolved to work well together with the delay. So the delay itself is usually considered a constraint, but since the constraint has been around for so long during the evolution, all the other systems are adjusted to work well with that constraint.
Yeah, well, that's quite an interesting aspect.
Thanks, Huawei. Vikash, you have a quick question?
Yeah, hey, thanks for the great talk. Just quickly, what do you call simple neural network? Like, how simple was it? Was it like one single neuron, or there is like a fully connected layer sitting there?
Yeah, so it's just a single input connected to an output. So for each muscle, I can yes, so there's no hidden layers, and there's no interconnectivity apart from the muscle on the opposite action, so the antagonistic muscle. Yeah. So for each muscle, there's 4 connections, basically 2 inputs, force and length for the same muscle and for the muscle on the other side. So it's really very simple.
Yeah, amazing. That's kind of amazing. And for the reward shaping, like, can you speak a little bit about how much the reward shaping has been done for those behaviors?
So the reward, I think, is just backwards. It's being optimized with an evolutionary strategy. So there's not, it doesn't have a reward per frame. It just looks at how far it moved backwards or how far it moved forwards. So it's very simple as well.
All right, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Alessandro, quick question?
Yeah, very super quick question. Thank you for the very nice presentation, Thomas. In one of your first slides, you showed that if you change the position of the tendon, not just in a few millimeters, this increases the range of motion. Can you tell me just a little bit how, in terms of millimeters, how much are you talking about this change in position?
Yeah, so the motion pattern changes a lot. Yeah, I think this is, in this example, it was like a centimeter or something like that, the position. So
okay.
So it's a few millimeters, but you can quickly see if you just use the same excitation pattern or the same activation pattern and you change it a little bit different, that the motion becomes different all of a sudden. And,
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So there is here some question in the chat. So maybe Thomas, if you have time to directly answer in the chat, we can pass to our second speaker, Alexander Mattis. So Alexander obtained his PhD at the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, Germany. He was then a postdoc at Harvard University in the US and Tübingen University in Germany. He is now an assistant professor at EPFL Switzerland. He is interested in elucidating how the brain gives rise to adaptive behavior. And for those purposes, he developed algorithms and systems to analyze animal behavior. So he's well known for the software Deep Lab Curve, and he also developed neural data as well as created experimentally tested computational model. So he obtained Chan Zuckerberg Initiative Award, a postdoctoral fellowship by the DFG in Germany, and a Marie Curie fellowship by the European Union. So, and the title of his talk will be Modeling Sensory Motor Circuit with Task-Driven and Reinforcement Learning. So, Thomas, Alexander, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's really excited to talk to this community. And I think the previous talk was really wonderful to follow up. It really showed that kind of intelligence evolved over many, many millions of years. And I think as a neuroscientist, my major interest, and also the major interest of the whole field in some sense, is to reverse engineer how the brain controls the body. And the way we want to do this is we want to kind of build, as you can see here on the right-hand side, we want to build artificial neural networks that can predict properties of the neural circuits, both in kind of firing patterns and also in behavior. So ideally, we would like to create systems that behave just like, let's say, a human behaves or a mouse behaves, and at the same time, the emerging circuits that we need in order to create this kind of behavior will actually also have some have features like it is found in the brain. And I'm going to talk you through one example of how we've done this for the proprioceptive system, and then I will also tell you something about the reverse approach. So where do we get these neural systems from, or how do we create these artificial systems? The idea is basically inspired by the classical approach of Marr, where he defines the way to look at an intelligent systems is at the computation level, algorithm level, and implementation level. And of course, neural networks are at the implementation level. And one way to link from computation to implementation is through task-driven modeling. So that really goes back to this idea of evolution. An organism is perhaps optimized for certain skills that are crucial for that organism. And therefore, you could actually ask the question, okay, if I, for example, want to build an optimal visual system, what kind of neural circuitry do I need to support this computation? And this approach has actually been taken very successfully for other sensory systems, and in particular to the left. Here is an example from Jim DiCarlo's lab at MIT, where they pushed this task-driven modeling for visual system, where you end-to-end train artificial systems on core object recognition. And based on these systems, you actually get the best neural explainability of actual neurons in the monkey's brain while the monkey sees a particular stimuli, like here, Marie Curie. And this very same approach has also been used for audition, touch, and thermoception. And we have extended this approach and used it in the context of proprioception, and I want to very briefly talk about this today. And so, as you all know, this is a motor control conference, so proprioception is the sense of posture, and it supports kind of the motor system in telling it where we are in space. And proprioception, as we saw also in the previous talk, is based on muscle spindles and on skin and on other receptors that are processed through the hierarchy, first to the spinal cord, then the brainstem, then up to the thalamus, and then from there to the cortex. And I think one core question is, of course, how is the state of the body represented at different levels of this hierarchy, and what kind of processing steps are actually required in order to support motor skills, motor intelligence, and so on. And the way we study this problem is with, as I was alluding to, with task-driven modeling. And when we started this project, OpenSim was the only option out there for this. And in order to do task-driven modeling, what we of course need is, we would need the putative input to the spinal cord during complex natural behavior, so that we can train models on those tasks. And in order to do this, we actually imposed movement on OpenSim models of the upper arm. We focused on the upper arm initially. We created lots of movements, and then we trained deep neural networks on those putative spinal cord input data to solve particular tasks. And then what we're interested in is comparing these neural networks to actual recordings in the brain of, for example, monkeys, and see if they learn representations as we observe them in the brain. Okay, and so this is based on a preprint where you can read more about it down here. And what we have now, so we've trained systems based on spindle input to solve tasks like, for example, where is my hand in space, or what kind of action am I carrying out? And then what we have access to is we have access to recordings from the Kunit nucleus in monkeys or in the primary somatosensory cortex. And it's monkeys that do a center out reaching task. So they reach to 8 different orientations. And what we were wondering is, okay, so if we train such a neural network and we fix all its weight, is this neural network good at explaining how neurons in the monkey brain respond to kind of this center out reaching task? And I should also say that in this specific task, they do it either in a passive or in an active condition where they're either doing it on their own or they're kicked by a magnet. Okay, and so what you see here now is that our model can do actually really well at explaining the neural data. So here you see in black the firing rate of one individual neuron in the Kunit nucleus. So this is brainstem, the first kind of relay into the brain after the spinal cord. And so, as I said, in black is the actual firing rate of a neuron, and these are test trials that our model hasn't seen. And then in red, you see the predicted firing rates that our model predicts for those tasks, for those particular reaches. And you can also appreciate, so down here, these are different test trials, and you always see the direction of the movement. So for this first movement, the monkey is actually moving to the lower left corner. And you can see that obviously, depending on the movement direction, actually this neuron responds differently. And our network can actually very nicely capture those dynamics of the neuron. And this upper one was actually for passive trial. The same is true for exactly the same model in an active trial where the monkey is actively moving the hand. Here, the interval is actually much longer, usually up to 1 second. And you can also see that if for 2 different reaches to the same direction, the model can just based on spindle inputs quite nicely predict the different dynamics of the actual neural data. And we are not only able to predict kind of neural data in Kunit nucleus, but also in the cortex up here to the right. And the way we quantify this now is we take into account explained variance, which just measures how much of the variance can our model capture of the actual variance in the data. And here, for example, this is an explained variance of 41, or this is of 63. And so what I'm going to show you now on the next slide is a summary plot where that is rather complex, and I'm going to explain to you. So on the x-axis is the accuracy for a particular task, namely an action recognition task, where each dot is a different model that is trained on this action recognition task. And on the y-axis is the explained variance of that model for explaining all the data of a particular monkey. So we have 3 monkeys that are in different colors. And what you can hopefully appreciate when you look at this plot is that a model that is better on this task, so it's more to the right, is also better at explaining the neural data in the monkey brain, which is to say, when we do task-driven modeling, we can actually create better models of the sensory system of the monkey's brain. And this is not only true if we train our models on action recognition, it's also true if we train our models, for example, on hand localization, where of course the correlation becomes inverse because lower MSE is better at localizing your hand. And the same is also true for S1. So in both kind of relays of the proprioceptive pathway, we can better explain single neuron firing rates if we create better models for explaining models that are better at solving particular tasks for the proprioceptive system. And then in the second half of the talk, I want to focus on kind of the inverse approach to study the brain that we also pursue in the lab. And that inverse approach basically is bottom-up modeling that you're all also familiar with, I'm sure. And in bottom-up modeling, the question is, okay, if we take some principles from neuroscience, are those principles actually helping us to create better AI systems, for example? And so we did that specifically in the context of adaptive locomotion. So as you can see in this video, humans are extremely adaptive. You can put humans on stilts and they can move around quite quickly. And that's not just true for humans, it's also true for ants. There's actually this beautiful paper to the right. I cannot explain all the details, but basically what they showed is that ants count their steps based on when they do path integration. And they could beautifully demonstrate this by putting ants on stilts or by shortening the legs of ants, which then makes them exactly overshoot or undershoot the distance that they travel. One of the side effects of this paper is that because they can immediately return to the location after you lengthen their legs, it shows that ants can just immediately walk with longer or shorter legs. So what's maybe the basis for this robustness of biological locomotion? And we wanted to study this in the context of artificial intelligence. So we started with this very standard kind of RL benchmark of walking as quickly as possible. And we adapted these. So specifically, we have here one agent that you see is an ant that has 8 different body parts. And we adapted this challenge to actually change the body. So at the beginning of every episode, we randomly sample a torso size, a limb length, and a limb size. And at the beginning of each episode, and we were interested in creating an agent that was able to control this changing body without ideally having any access to the parameters of its body. Okay, so what we can of course do is we can parameterize this, and in the center we have a smaller variability with a smaller sigma, and then we can increase the sigma to make it even more challenging for an agent that we want to train. So as a first controller that you can throw at this problem is of course like a vanilla baseline controller where you simply take, let's say, the proprioceptive state of this robot and you train an MLP to create actions in order to run as fast as possible. We would expect that this agent performs well if sigma, so the variability is small enough, and if sigma is large enough, of course, the performance will drop. So to juxtapose this with an agent that will be extremely good at this task, we created an agent called the Oracle task, or the Oracle agent, where we essentially take the ground truth raw perturbation, so the complete state of the body, and we encode it also with an MLP, which gives us a latent embedding of the morphology, and then we feed this to an MLP that predicts the actions. So as you can see, if you think of this reinforcement learning agent, then of course that's an oracle that actually has complete access to the state of the body. And we can successfully train these baseline models. And as you can appreciate, when you look at these performance curves up here, obviously if we increase sigma, then the overall performance goes down. That's both true for the baseline model and for the encoding model, but or the encoding the oracle. But the oracle performance is of course much higher because it has access to the state of the body, or including the parameters of the body. So now what we wanted to do is we wanted to create an agent that is as good as the oracle, but that actually doesn't have access to the parameters of the body. And so we were looking for an inductive bias that can make it trainable to reach this performance without having access to the body parameters. And for that, we kind of took inspiration from biology. And in particular, we took 3 pieces of information from biology. The first piece of information is that proprioceptive information in the body is actually independently processed first in the spinal cord. So you have like a local circuit that deals with a given given spindle before you actually connect it over to, let's say, other muscle groups and other spindle groups. And then depending on where you look in the brain, but for example, as you can see it here on the left, in the brain there's a sensory homunculus and a motor homunculus. And only the sensory homunculus and the motor homunculus, they give a very high level representation. And between those, there's kind of a dynamic gating that the brain can use in order to solve tasks. So we put that into our model. And we also, not like in standard RL, let's say, we didn't use like single controller, but we actually used a distributed controller per muscle or per actuator. And overall, this looks like this. So for our agent, we get the proprioceptive state history, and then we feed into a TCN for each sensor independently. And then we actually have one attention layer that can dynamically gate the information from a given sensor to a given actuator and can decide how it should gate that information. And as I said, for each muscle or for each actuator, we have one controller. So now the exciting thing with this architecture called DMAP that was actually just presented at NeurIPS, we could train this architecture end to end for 4 different morphologies and basically reach the performance of the oracle without, during training, giving it access to the parameters of its body. So it only gets the proprioceptive input. It doesn't get any of the morphological parameters. And this was the differences were particularly striking for the end, but also for the walker, which intrinsically is unstable. And one thing that is exciting about this architecture, I think, is because it uses a transformer layer, we can, of course, it's interpretable, and we can look at how the model learns to gate sensory to motor information. And you can see this in these plots. And essentially, if you look at them long enough, you can see that bilateral symmetry emerges, or front-back symmetry. And we were very excited about this. And furthermore, we were quite excited to see that the attentional weight in this transformer layer is not static, but as a matter of fact, it actually depended when we embedded the whole attentional weight into a low-dimensional space. Then we noticed that the dynamics is actually dependent on the gate cycle of any one of those 4 agents. And that's exciting because in the spinal cord, actually the synaptic connectivity, the functional connectivity is also dependent on the gate cycle. So with that, what I've talked about 2 stories, one kind of using task-driven modeling to reverse engineer sensory motor circuits in the brain. And I focused particularly on the proprioceptive system, and I showed how we can use musculoskeletal models to do this, and that we can actually create a recipe for creating better proprioceptive systems by training models that better solve proprioceptive tasks. And I also talked about DMAP, which I think is quite an interesting model where we use principles from biology to learn a robust controller. And so with that, I want to thank my lab. And I want to thank in particular Alberto Chiappa, who is part of both of these projects, and also Alessandro, who's over here, also a graduate student in my lab, and who is also part of both of these projects. So with that, I'm happy to take questions.
Thanks. So now we can go to the question part. So if you have any question. Yes, Vittorio.
Alexander, great talk. Just one quick question on the DMAP. So from the architecture, it seems like you integrate everything later on. So you first create like independent representations. How dependent is this step? So the merging, as you mentioned, happens earlier in the system at the level of the spinal cord. So how much that connectivity it might be lost by integrating only later?
Right. I mean, so your question, I'm not sure how I interpret so is your question about the fact that, let's say, you also have dynamical gating in the spinal cord?
Yes. So if you integrate earlier on, how much the results change?
Yeah, I think that so we're not necessarily saying that this gating here in DMAP is above the spinal cord. In fact, you could interpret this dynamical gating here as a dynamic gating mechanism within the spinal cord. And in fact, we know from recordings that people have that the synaptic connectivity within the spinal cord is dynamically gated. But when I kind of introduced it, I did kind of motivate it more with the homunculus, which I think is another location in the brain where you have dynamic gating between high-level representations. And I think, and we are working actively on a hierarchical DMAP version. It is true that, let's say, this one here only has one attentional gating channel between the sensory and the motor outputs. But of course, in the brain, there are multiple loops that can achieve that in parallel.
So characteristic like reflexes, would you be able to recover in this architecture?
Right. So maybe I didn't give too. So the controller for each muscle, so let's say whatever, or for a particular actuator, actually gets the sensory state from that sensor automatically. So that is bypassed. So in some sense, you could say it has a stretch reflex built in, and then there's on top the dynamical gating.
Okay, makes sense. Thanks.
Yes.
Okay, thanks. So I think now it's time for the break. So we will continue. We will be back in 3 minutes for the talk of Alessandro Del Vecchio. And if you have more questions for Alexander, you can also write it in the chat. Okay, I hope everyone is back. Okay, so after the very nice talk from Alexander, I think we will go a little bit lower on the control chain to look more at muscle and neural decoding of muscle with the talk of Alessandro Del Vecchio. So Alessandro Del Vecchio obtained his PhD at the University of Rome in 2017, and then he continued as a postdoc at Imperial College London. He's currently an assistant professor at the Department of AI in Biomedical Engineering at Friedrich Alexander University, Erlangen, and Nuremberg University in Germany, where he's leading the neuromuscular physiology and neural interfacing laboratory. His study focused on the neuromechanics of human movement, including the analysis and processing of surface EMG signal and all motor unit encode muscle forces. So the title of his talk is Physiological Mapping of the Muscle Electrical Activity into Behavior, Principle of Neuromechanics, High-Density Electromyography System, and New Decoding Algorithms. So Alessandro, you can share your screen and start.
Okay, thank you, Guillermo, and thank everyone for the invitation to this very nice workshop. My talk will be related on how the nervous system controls muscle forces. So how we basically move our hands at a motor neuron level. During the talk, I will first start how we can sense basically this full neural output that comes from the spinal cord to the muscle and that controls the human hand. So I will, in the first part of the talk, we will look at some artificial intelligent methods that can map muscular electrical activity into dynamics. And then we will look also how we can get information from the muscles and the electromyograph to identify the activity of individual motor neurons, as you see them here, showed as a raster plot. And in this enables us to have a direct way to sense the only human neural cells that can be measured with minimal invasive methods. Then I will also talk about a little bit what also Alex was discussing, so a top-bottom approach, so that we go from the brain, so from the electrical activity generated by neurons, and then we map this electrical activity into behavior. And we can do that through an artificial intelligence method, so towards the feed-forward neural networks. And then we can study the embedding of these neural networks. So we can look at the latent spaces and we can understand if, for example, the artificial intelligence learns some artistic, anatomical, and physiological features that, as you see them here. And this is quite interesting, in my opinion, because it allows a bidirectional learning, so that in one way you can study the nervous system through electrophysiological activity and deep learning, and in other way you can understand the AI through the electrophysiological activity and our knowledge of physiology, because we have a background knowledge of physiology. So I think we can appreciate from these talks that, you know, already the Moravec's paradox, already in the year 1988, he postulated that it's easy to make computers exhibit adult level performance or intelligence test or playing checkers, and difficult or impossible to give them the skills of a 1-year-old when it comes to perception and mobility. So in this talk, I will focus a lot on the mobility aspects, and you know, this task is quite challenging. It's quite challenging because from one way we have a very large number of muscle, but this is not the only problem. Is that the nervous system finally controls muscle through the activity of spinal motor neurons. So spinal motor neurons are located in the ventral lobe of the spinal cord, and we do not have many of these motor neurons, but a few hundreds control the activity of an individual muscle. As you can see here, these are arranged in columns in the spinal cord, and each motor neurons then innervates a unique number of muscle fibers. And the size of these neural cells in the ventral lobe of the spinal cord range very widely. And you can see here, this is a human performing an isometric movement that goes from 0 to 35% of maximum voluntary force. This is an isometric ankle dorsiflexions. And this is each of these row represent one motor unit firing times. And you can see that in this example, the nervous system is recruiting progressively new motor unit. And also, the other mechanism that the brain utilizes to control muscle force is to modulate the firing rate of the neuron. Here you see the same neuron that is tracked across different force contractions. So this is a very slow forced ramp contraction at about 5 MVC per second. And this is a relatively fast movement. And this is a feed-forward movement, okay? This is a rapid explosive task. And you can see the first thing that comes evident on the y-axis here. You have the pulses per second. So this is the firing rate of the neurons. You can see a very strong modulation of the firing rate when the contraction is fast. On the other hand, when the nervous system is controlling force in a very slow way, the discharge rate is very low, but also the recruitment threshold changes. During a fast movement, this unit is recruited even before the generation of force, while here we have it approximately halfway through the contraction. So now here it was a single joint movement, okay? This was a single isometric ankle dorsiflexion. So if now we look at when we perform a very skilled movement, so for example, when we grasp a CD-ROM, I mean, nowadays we don't anymore grasp CD-ROMs, but when you can see a large number of objects, and if you plot the two principal components, of the kinematics, when reaching this object, you see that there are lots of many objects that are displayed that share a similar manifold. But it is very important to realize, I mean, just for example, see here a rope and a knife. These show they are located in a very similar manifold, but these very small differences change the way you interact with that object. And if you look at the number of principal components plotted against the information transmitted, you can see that there is a first component that explains most of the variance, but then there are very small components that explain the remaining variance. And these very small components are the one that the brain uses to fine-tune the recruitment of some spinal motor neurons in order to grasp either a knife or a rope and so on. So these are very fine modulation that the nervous system is accomplishing. And we can study this with electrophysiological activity. And one way to do that is by placing high-density grids of electrodes on top of the muscles, as you see them here, and we can record the unique action potential of the motor neuron discharge timings, because the motor neurons, when it reaches the muscle fibers, it creates a one-to-one connection within a distinct number of muscle fibers. And this one-to-one connection is called the motor unit. So the motor unit is a number of muscle fiber innervated by one single motor neuron. And we can identify motor units with high-density grids of electrodes or by going invasively inside the muscle. Once we identify the spike times, we can then make inferences, direct inference of neural behavior, of neural discharge characteristic and behavior in case of movement and so on. So the EMG, it is a signal that during isometric movement is a linear signal that is basically you have a spinal cord and you have a series of firings. And these can be modeled by Dirac delta functions. And then these Dirac delta functions are transformed at the muscle level by some filters that you see them here. They are displayed by the H factor here, and this is the delta of the discharge timings plus some other noise, and the algebraic summation of all of the action potential generates the EMG. Okay, so then we can apply some methods that can go from the EMG back to the trains into the spinal cord. But also we can develop methods, as I will show you first now, that ignore this part. So ignore the neural information, but just look at behavior and try to map electrical activity into behavior without having any information about the discharge rate. Or we can then, as I will show you at the second part of the presentation, we can decompose the EMG signal and look directly at motor units. So the challenge that we have here is that we have a neural information, and this is a series of zeros and ones. It's a binary code that arrives to the muscle and generates hand dynamics. So we want to predict the full dynamics of the human hand with from the electrophysiological activity that is generated by the efferent spinal cord output and muscle dynamics. And essentially, we want to do this by measuring the electrical activity, having a model that outputs the hand kinematics and dynamics, also the forces, because with the electrical, the EMG is much more related to the forces of the muscle rather than to the movement. Okay. So this is our experimental setup and the team that helped in this project. And then you see, I mean, here we have a motion capture system and high density electromyography. We record more than 300 channels of the forearm muscles, and then here we display to the subject the task with a virtual hand that is synchronized with the monitor, with EMG. And so we use Alexander tools that works beautifully to markerless extract kinematics from the hand. And then we, as you see here, this is an example of our experiment. So basically, we ask subjects to do virtually all the degrees of freedom of the human hand, which is the individual digit movements, grasping, two-finger grasp, and at 2 movement speed, so low and fast movements. And then Raul in the lab developed a neural network. It is a feed-forward 3-dimensional convolutional neural network that you can input the EMG signal as an output. We want to predict the kinematics or the kinetics. I didn't show it to you, but we measure the kinetics with an instrumented force sensor. It's a ball. And this once we applied this feed-forward neural network with basically the error matrix is the Euclidean distance between the ground truth, which is the markerless pose estimation, and predicted, we obtain relatively. So we first have to scale the two hands. We have to rotate it, and we apply procrustes analysis to scale the two hands. Then we can compare these two by Euclidean distance measures, and we see for the test set we obtain very low errors in the order of 7 millimeters, and for the random movement set, this is unseen data, we are in the order of 19 millimeters. So this is this type of error. If you are familiar with the EMG field, this is obtained across 22 degrees of freedom. So it's basically it gives us a resolution that is very similar to cameras. And you know, if you look current prosthetics, they can control 3 or 4 degrees of freedom continuously. And here you see basically the predictions, and on the left and on the right you see the camera driven on the unseen data, and the AI it's learning quite well to predict the kinematics. So the force it learns very well, but this is is already known in the literature that EMG is highly correlated to isometric muscle force. But it seems that the AI it's learning something quite important. So we wanted now to understand what the eye is learning, because we have quite a bit of knowledge about the neural inputs to the forearm muscle. Yeah? So we know that, you know, where the agonist, antagonist muscle are and which muscle encodes what. So we basically then projected these the latent components of the neural network with a factorization method, a nonlinear factorization method, to study the predictions. It was important to do a small step before that to understand if our network can also generalize in real time. And so one issue that we had, because I mean, we really, I think in neuroscience, we really need to try to push that our methods work in real time, because you know, if we have a lot of training data and we know the future, it is relatively easy to, you know, to make inferences. But I think we have something that is robust if it works in real time, yeah, because the brain works in real time. So this is now the ground truth, and here you have the predicted kinematics from the AI. You can see that it's a large. It's very jittery. And this with procrustes analysis it was removed, but you cannot apply procrustes analysis in real time. So a student developed now a linear regression on top of the artificial intelligence, and these systems basically estimates the prediction of the AI. It is a filter essentially, but it is let's say a smart filter that basically it allows you to filter the AI input And interestingly, because the EMG is a signal that it precedes movement, it seems that because of the delays that you have between the muscle and movement, there are electromechanical delays. It seems that the AI and this linear method is predicting the movement of the hand even before the actual movement that we record. And you see now an application in real time where this is how we test basically the system, where you have the EMG system, and then we have a ground truth and then the prediction, and then we ask the subject basically to follow the ground truth, the data that is displayed on the monitor, and then we can calculate the Euclidean distance between the ground truth and the prediction. So the individual digit is quite tough. It generalizes very well for gross movement. So like when you want to, for example, close your hand and close your fist, but also, I mean, now we achieved precision also to have individual digit movements of the ring and little finger that were tough during pinching action. And this is done with very minimal training. So here there is approximately 15 minutes of training before the AI is deployed in real time. Okay, and the postures, interestingly, the postures, as you see here, for example, the peace sign, it works incredibly well. The rock sign works also very well. This is likely because the neural activity there is very sparse. Okay, as you will see in a minute. So then we can, we can look at the neural activity directly. And we can do this because we know a lot. This is basic physiological study that if you apply a sensor on top of the muscle, you have all of these areas. These are simulation studies that showed unique action potentials of the motor units. And these action potentials are a series of discharge timings from the motor neurons. And they are very clustered depending on where the motor unit is and the surface EMG grids are. And each of the motor unit has distinct location. So now we can go back and we can look, for example, here, as you see here in this slide, this is work from Marius, where you have the index digit position, an EMG signal, and some motor unit spike trains that are related, that encode this movement. And you can see here, there are like a huge number of motor units that are postural motor units that are just basically holding the hand in this position. But then there are some other motor units that alternate. And these basically are the motor units, are the flexion and extensor motor units. And as you can see, they're perfectly out of phase with respect to the task. Interestingly, when then we track motor units across tasks. So in this case, you have a middle index finger movement and index finger movement. Okay, these are two separate movements. Then we track the units that are the same. You can see that there are a large number of motor units that are there, and these are from the same muscles. But interestingly, what in the black here, the unique units are the ones that are basically the prime mover units that actually make the movement, generate the movement. And there are others that are very silent and flat. They are very postural, but interestingly, in this case, as you can see here, there is this motor unit here that is it shows a phasic behavior, and here it's completely constant, the firing rate, and you can see here when you smooth the discharge rate, basically you take the spike train and you filter the spike train, and you can see here for index and middle, these are two units that share a similar manifold. While here in the index, it's a flat motor unit. Here it's very in the middle, it is phasic, and the opposite you see here for index and middle. So the same motor unit has a relatively flexible behavior. It can be either postural or change encode flexion and extension. And you see here the manifolds, when you plot this unit from the same motor pool, these are the units from the same motor pool, one against the other, you can see that, some of them actually do not share the same manifold, as you see here. And when we pull all the motor units together, we found that there are two main components that explain the variability of all the discharge rate of all motor units. Basically, this one here and this one here, it's flexion and extension. And the units that are here in the middle that have no correlation to these modules are the postural unit, the one that encode the postures of the hand. So, and finally, we can apply some of these methods to spinal cord injury. This is the last part I wanted to show you. So now, once you know that, once you have a robust decoding algorithms, there are so many humans with spinal cord injury that have the hand that is paralyzed. But this, despite years of paralysis, there are some spare connection from the brain to these motor neurons. And these motor neurons are still alive, but there are not many. So they cannot, as you can see here, the person cannot generate any movement of the hand, although he's trying as much as he can, to contract the fingers. And when we put this patient in closed loop with a feedback and we decompose the motor unit in real time, we can see that the person can really manage to control this unit and to follow a task quite accurately. And then you can leverage the knowledge from the decoding algorithms, and we can make the person control. In this case, is a virtual hand. So now these are the results from 6 subjects and the number of degrees of freedom that they still have. You see here, this person that had a spinal cord injury for more than 15 years, and then we basically asked to. This is the control hand, which is the hand that explain the task to the patient, and this is the predicted hand that is controlled with a machine learning method through the EMG, and you can see that it can proportionally control the index finger in this case, but it can also switch from another dimension. He had 4 degrees of freedom and open and close the fist, despite no movement and years of paralysis. I mean, we believe that it is due to the fact that the spinal cord injuries are never complete. There are contusions, so there is always some spare connection in the spinal cord that is still left over after the injury, and likely this is what we are capturing. Okay, so some conclusion. So electrophysiology and deep learning, I think, can give us an unprecedented insight in how the nervous system works. And for the detailed physiological insight, the electrophysiological activity should be decomposed at the direct cellular level, especially if we want to understand the physiology about how we are actually moving the hand. And I think something that is relatively interesting is that EMG, because it's a sensor, we can embed it into garments, and this will allow us, imagine if we will wear, all of us, some hundreds of EMG sensors, we could really gather a lot of information and reconstruct basically movement of the person, so without any other inputs. So this is, I think, is particularly interesting also for the prevention of many diseases. And with this, I want to thank you for your attention. And if you have any question, please go ahead.
Thanks, Alejandro. Alessandro, for the nice talk. So maybe we have time for like one very quick question. So Alexander. We cannot hear you. I think you're muted.
I think he was just clapping. I don't think he was.
Okay.
Correct me if I'm wrong.
Okay, then
I do have
a
quick. Yeah, I do have a
very quick question then.
Yeah. So let's say you for the paralyzed patient, then you decompose the motion and you shoot in the simulation. So it doesn't mean that if you use FES to activate the muscles, you can actually make them while the patient do the motions.
Yes, you mean with an exoskeleton, for example?
No, FES. So with the
functional electrical stimulation. Yes,
yeah.
yes, absolutely. I don't know if they will create some interference. Probably will, but you can have a closed loop system with FES. Also, you could use an exoskeleton, in my opinion, because it will. You can, for example, you can have a tendon-driven exoskeleton. That now. They get very high accuracy, but yeah, you can also use FES, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thanks, Huawei. Thanks, Alessandro, for the talk. So now we will go to the next speaker, Wendy Murray. So Wendy obtained her PhD in biomedical engineering from Northwestern University in the US. She's currently a full professor in the Department of Biomedical Engineering, Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation, Physical Therapy, and Human Movement Science. She's the Director of Applied Research in Musculoskeletal Simulation at the laboratory of the Shirley Ryan Ability Lab, and where she is appointed as a research scientist. Her focus is on the development of biomechanical models that accurately represent the mechanical action of the upper extremity muscle. The main goal of her current research is application of this model to better understand and ultimately to help improve function for the disabled upper limb. So the title of her talk is Musculoskeletal Model of the Hand and Wrist capable of simulating functional tasks. So Wendy, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to talk. It's been very exciting to see all the work that's going on. I'm really excited to share the advances my lab has been making in the development and implementation of a biomechanical model of the hand and wrist. I think a little bit unlike the previous speakers, my focus has been primarily, if you've heard lots of people talking about the controller, my focus has been on understanding the plant with the idea, as the first speaker brought up, that these systems have evolved together over hundreds and hundreds of years, and understanding the plant, to me, is an important component of understanding the controller. So I like to start out with the idea that biomechanical modeling and simulation are important tools, as we've seen in the previous talks, and they enable what I consider to be novel insights about movement and neural control. In my lab, modeling and simulation serve as methodological tools that advance the types of questions we can ask about the upper limb. And we definitely need an effective integrated biomechanical model of the hand and wrist. Specifically, in my opinion, we need to take advantage of all possible approaches to better understand this unique, elegant, and very deeply personal component of our musculoskeletal system. To put it bluntly, there is no stereotypical way that we use our hands and our arms. Our hands are the primary interface we have with our environment. They are a fundamental part of how we take care of ourselves, how we take care of others, how we communicate, and how we connect with other people. The musculoskeletal anatomy of the hand is also extremely elegant and complex. Many of the muscles that actuate the fingers and thumb originate in the forearm, and they have simultaneous actions about multiple joints in the fingers, as well as the forearm and the wrist. Given these factors, it really isn't surprising that there's a long history of biomechanical simulation of the hand. Biomechanists have often sought to use modeling to understand hand impairment. Simulation attempts include models to better understand hand dysfunction following surgery. Here I'm showing some figures from a paper we published that was about understanding changes in the way the hand functions and hand strength after there's been orthopedic surgical redesigns of the wrist. Biomechanists also use models to understand dysfunction associated with neural impairment. Here I'm showing what's referred to as a claw finger deformity, a common deformity that happens if muscles that originate and insert in your hand are either severely weakened, such as following stroke or radial palsy, or are paralyzed, such as in cervical spinal cord injury. In addition, biomechanists use biomechanical models to understand risk factors that arise due to functional use of the hand in every day. What has been missing in biomechanics is the implementation of a model of the whole hand for simulation of complex functional tasks that require coordinated effort from all 5 digits of the hand. Foundational work and pioneering work from Case Western Reserve University, including work from Joe Mansour and Pat Crago, was aimed towards the goal of identifying control strategies for functional electrical stimulation following cervical spinal cord injury, similar to the type of work that we just saw in the previous talk. This work was ahead of the curve in that their models integrated the wrist and the hand, but these simulations were limited to the thumb and the index finger. In general, it's still true that most of the time biomechanical simulations of hand function focus on primarily a single digit. To my knowledge, up to this point of the model I'm going to be describing, the only model of grasping that included all of the digits has been the elegant inverse dynamics work published by our colleagues in France from Aix-Marseille University. So with that background established, I'd like to introduce my lab's work building a model of the whole hand that's compatible with forward dynamic simulations. So building biomechanical models of the upper limb has been the foundation for my career, and the release of this hand model has been a bit overwhelming to me when I look back at the full timeline that led to it. So I started working on biomechanical model when I was a first year in graduate school, and it's really been the thread throughout my entire career. In 2007, I planted my flag in Chicago as a professor, and my current research lab, the ARMS lab, was founded. My lab is very unique in that we're a multi-institutional lab, as was noted in the introduction. My primary appointment is as a professor at Northwestern University, but my lab is actually located in a hospital, the Shirley Ryan Ability Lab. And I also maintain an affiliation with the Department of Veterans Affairs, the institution where I started my independent research career as a scientist. Given the state of the upper limb model, when I started my professorship and when I landed in Chicago, extending the upper limb model to include a more complete model of the hand became a primary goal of my laboratory. And I've been fortunate to have worked with a parade of talented students, postdocs, and engineers to get this done. Dr. Daniel McFarland is a former postdoctoral researcher in my lab who now works in industry, and he's the first author of a manuscript that was recently accepted for publication, and he brought the model across the finish line for us. This model is currently freely available for research use on SimTK. And since my lab was founded at Northwestern, sorry, this little flag should be on the other side there, I went back and counted, and we have about 17 papers that we have published that serve as sort of the mechanical foundation to the current implementation of the model. As is illustrated by this timeline, modeling decisions have been made incrementally over the years, and many details about these decisions you can find in the ARMS lab publication history. So the primary work I'll be presenting today is Daniel's implementation of the model for forward dynamic simulation of maximum effort grip force. Grip strength is the force applied by the hand to pull on or to suspend from objects and is a specific part of hand strength. Grip strength is a critical clinical measure of hand function and has also been shown to have a predictive link to both all-cause and disease-specific mortality. To compute grip strength, we simulated a commonly used clinical dynamometer, shown here, this purple device in the figure on the bottom right. It's a handheld device with an adjustable grip, and we simulated it with a cylinder. We chose the dimensions and the mass of the cylinder to reflect the clinical testing parameters used when healthy adults generate maximum grip force. We used an elastic foundation contact model between the skin of the phalanges and the cylinder. All our simulations are being done in OpenSim at this point. The teal cylinders that overlaid on the individual bone segments here represent the skin. and the normal component of the contact forces between the proximal and intermediate phalanges in the cylinder yielded our measurement of grip force. And this was really evaluated with the intent of mimicking the clinical testing apparatus. So here I'm just visualizing when we're doing a forward simulation of grip force, this green arrow sort of illustrates the force that you would predict. So within OpenSim, we used optimal control theory to define the muscle activations that maximize grip force. We constrained the number of muscles optimized to be 15, and we made those constraints based on the mechanics of the task. For example, in both the clinical tests and our simulation, the thumb does not contribute to grip force. So we didn't include those muscles in the simulation, even though they're included in our model. Similarly, the intrinsic muscles of the hand, those are those muscles that I talked about before that have both an origin and insertion within the hand. They always acted to increase grip force. So since we were trying to simulate maximum grip force, we just turned those on to be 100%. The optimization then solved for constant activations held for a period of 0.15 seconds. And we implemented a simulated annealing optimization algorithm in MATLAB 2018 using the OpenSim API. We did not constrain wrist posture during these simulations. We left that free, but we encouraged maintenance of the initial posture with a penalty function similar to what would happen in the clinical measurements. So how strong is our model? Simulated grip force replicated experimental data describing maximum grip force measured in healthy adults. So here the orange bars, indicate the average and standard deviation of the top 5 strongest simulations from 50 repeated simulated annealing optimization trials. The blue bar is the average strength, the average grip strength measured in 20 healthy participants reported in a classic study out of the Mayo Clinic. We chose this study for comparison as it's frequently cited as evidence that grip strength depends highly on wrist position, which was something we wanted to explore with our model. The average wrist position adopted by the 20 participants in the study from 1992, when they were allowed to self-select wrist position during maximum grip force, was extended and slightly only deviated. And so we did our simulations in that same wrist posture as well. And our model was able to generate a comparable level of grip force in that clinically measured wrist posture. The study from the Mayo Clinic reports a substantial drop-off in grip strength when wrist posture is shifted away from that self-selected posture. While our simulations illustrate a similar dependence of grip strength on wrist posture, we didn't see the same magnitude of drop-off in strength. And so we just like to note that there is this important relationship between wrist posture and grip force, and we hope by enabling the simulation, the forward simulation of grip force with wrist posture as a part of the problem, we hope that our novel tool and simulation ability can be used in conjunction with experimental tests to deepen our understanding of the source of this variability. Now we're moving on to a comparison with another experimental study, and this is getting at how the grip force is distributed across the different fingers in the hand. So when we compare how grip force is generated among the 4 fingers, we see that our model's grip force predictions replicate very well data from the study from South Korea. In both the experimental data and the simulations, the middle finger had the largest contribution to grip force and averaged around 40%. The ring finger had the smallest, and the index and little finger had kind of comparable contributions. And this is just to note that The grip in this experimental study, this grip force measurement, was taken in a different wrist posture than in the self-selected posture from O'Driscoll, and just sort of highlighting the importance of thinking about the wrist as part of how the hand is generating force and how important that is to represent. So finally, a third study from Peter Keir's group in Canada. They're showing the activation levels of the primary extrinsic finger muscles, primary wrist extensors, and primary wrist flexors during a maximum grip force task. Again, we're in a different wrist posture than any of the other experimental studies. And we kind of accommodated for each of these differences in wrist postures when we're doing the direct comparison. So our optimal control theory predicted slightly different activations than what was measured in this study, where they showed that really in their maximum grip force, they didn't see maximum activations for any of those muscles we talked about. But in our optimal control results, it predicted that the extrinsic finger muscles, both extensors and flexors, and the wrist extensors were activated very high. In contrast, one of the biggest differences we saw between our simulations and this single experimental study was that our optimal control algorithm did not choose to activate the wrist flexors, even though Moak and Keir's studies showed that they were activated pretty consistently relative to the other muscles in the experimental study. At this point, I just want to emphasize that I'm unaware of any other simulations that have enabled us to study the coordination of wrist and finger muscles in a maximum grip force task in general. And we hope that by developing this model and these methods, we're providing new opportunities for collaboration between modeling groups and experimentalists that will ultimately advance our insight into how these muscles are coordinated to produce not just grip force, but functions that are really critical for the way we use our arms and hands. So to conclude, I think that this comment from our manuscript review perfectly captures my feelings about where we stand with biomechanical modeling of the hand and wrists. What I'm presenting to you is by no means the final version of this model, and we anticipate there's much work to be done, but I really feel proud of the idea that while it's not perfect, it is a major advance in our ability to simulate the hand. And it feels like a really important first step, particularly when we see all the work that's going on in scientists such as the others that have presented here and the MyoSuite goals as well. So we hope this tool will help move the field forward. So I focused on grip force implementation here, but our paper and the SimTK project also describe and provide tutorials for a range of other tasks that we hope others will use and build on. We've also recently been consulting with the MyoSuite team as they work to implement this model in their own simulation environment to address differences in implementation with the goal of maintaining the integrity of the biomechanics that we've worked so hard to model in my lab. So to keep on time and to foster discussion, I'll end here, and I'll thank the Arms Lab students and alumni, as well as longtime collaborators and the range of funding sources that have made all of this work possible. So thank you.
Thanks a lot, Wendy, for this very nice talk. So we have time for a very quick question. Huawei.
Oh, I was clapping, but I do have a quick question maybe. So it's really very fundamental work and it's really important for all the like studies shown here. I was wondering for the hand model, you mentioned to validate model, you actually the maximum grabbing force as was validated. Is there any other like type of movement you think will be suitable to validate, let's say, individual fingers and like the corresponding muscles?
Yeah, so thanks. That's a great question. And, there's always room to improve validation, but this slide, let's see if I can get the videos running. We have done a lot of validation, sort of many of those publications leading up to this one are about our simulation of lateral pinch force. And so there's lots of evidence of how well our model is replicating pinch force. Similar to the grip force, there's also activations and pinch force magnitudes. Francisco Valero Cuevas group has obviously provided lots of great data that has helped us with that. We also, with data collected from our own lab, see if I can get these simulations running again, whoops. These static optimization solutions, we measured EMGs and kinematics of hand opening and closing. And, in the model, you can see, or in the paper, you can see a replication of that. This is all passive. We replicated the fact that, again, these muscles cross the forearm and wrist as well as the fingers. And so there's this linking of, even passively, there's this mechanical linkage between hand opening and wrist flexion and extension. And so just this is a part of our model that not very many people, if I think anyone, has included previously. So a collaborator of mine here at Northwestern, Lee Miller, and I, we have just received a really great score on a new grant, and we'll be doing some more data collection, and there will be further validation of the model. But I think it's one of those things that whatever you want to use it for, if it kind of falls outside these big classes of things, there's always going to be room to test the model more and see how it's working for your specific function.
Yeah, for sure. But glad to know that you're keep improving the models. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Huawei, for the question, and Wendy for the answer. So now it's time for our next presentation from one of the winner team of the MyoChallenge. So we will have a presentation from Nishit Patel, which is currently doing a PhD with Professor Alexandre Pouget in theoretical neuroscience, working on normative theory of decision-making and memory. His current research interests lie in representation learning, reinforcement learning, and control. So his team won the Bowling Ball Challenge and is also currently on the market for a job. So Nishit, if you want to start.
Sorry, I realized I was muted, and yeah, okay. So yeah, at the outset, I would like to mention that this was a team effort, not just mine, and we actually flipped the coin, actually rolled the die to see who's going to present. So also would like to thank Alberto and Pablo, who are equal contributors to this, and the supervisors as well. So, okay, the bowling balls task, thanks Victoria and Huawei for introducing the challenge, but I'm going to briefly mention it again in case our working memories are less than 1 hour. So the goal in phase 1 was to rotate the balls in the counterclockwise direction. Here's the schematic of the musculoskeletal arm. And both the ball's initial positions, the target trajectories, and the rotation speeds were all fixed, right? And to act, you had to activate 39 muscles, which you can see here by these little string thingies. And the observation space was also like fairly big. So it had 23 joint angles, the position and velocity of both the balls, position of both the targets. You had error between the balls and the targets. You can't actually see the targets because they're in the center of the balls, but otherwise you can see them separately. So the vector that points from the balls to the targets is part of the observation space. And then you also have actions at the previous time step. I think in total it was like 86 dimensional. And the rewards were slightly open to be manipulated by us or introduced by us. But briefly, there were like distance between the balls and the targets. You could have action regularization to like optimize effort. And you had rewards for solving the task, which means when the ball overlaps with the target, it's a binary reward of 1 per time step. And similarly, you could have a reward for being alive, which is when the balls are not dropped out to the floor. Dropped out of the hand, sorry. So why is this task difficult? Well, first, the balls are extremely unstable, and exploration is very challenging, unlike many other problems. So if you do random actions, this is what happens. It literally chucks the balls every time. And there are many bad trajectories where the balls just fall. And the environment is also very complex. So amongst the things that makes it complex, it's important to point out there's the credit assignment is pretty difficult. So unlike standard MoJoCo environments, the actions have long-term consequences. So activating one muscle can actually act on like 40 time steps in the environment. It's partially observable, so joint target velocities are not part of the observation space. And the control of the joints is with very large continuous action spaces, and it's also indirect, right? And there are a couple other things that make it difficult. First, the rewards, at least in practice, seem to be difficult to balance, right? So dropping the balls is often more convenient than solving the task, because otherwise you just keep getting the negative rewards. And so you kind of need the incentive to stay alive, but also if you don't tune it carefully, it's really hard. And yeah, like it might just stick to staying alive, but not rotate the balls, because anything that you do that is bad is it's gonna be better to chuck the balls down instead. So and finally, if you're using a curriculum to learn this task, it is full of hazards. So for example, whoops, this one is not working. That's unfortunate, but basically what happens, if you can see my video, is the arm learns to like grip the balls and like just hold it there. And as soon as it does something else, like if you want them to move, it opens the arms and then both the balls fall. So yeah, that's the and now looking at how we approached it, well, the first thing we did was use some on-policy learning with PPO. And this is with LSTM units in both the actor and the critic. And the LSTM layers are kind of crucial to deal with partial observability and temporally extended actions. And second, much more importantly, we use a curriculum that we're going to call static to dynamic stability curriculum, right? So very briefly, what this, or to give you an intuition, what this does is it first creates stability at desired states. And it does this before learning a policy that actually reaches those states. I'll show you in a schematic what this means later. But and second, then you have a curriculum that gradually transforms these statically stable solutions into dynamical movement motifs, right? So as a very quick schematic, here's what it looks like. So first you have just like these two balls, yellow and red, at various points along the trajectory, kind of just learn to be held like, at those points. And then you move them very slightly at or slow rotation speeds, make it faster over time, and then you have the final task that is being solved. Okay, and the final solution actually looks like that. But before that, we had a bunch of other, so the static solutions look more like that, and then the slow rotation periods are in the middle. This is about half the speed of the final task, and you gradually learn a curriculum that does this. And crucially, if you go directly from here to here, so from static stability to the final task, it fails based on our studies. And also, if you go gradually from here to here, so you slowly increase the rotation speed, it worked really well. So we got 100% performance, and we did an ablation study to see what was actually useful. And there were two things, so like multiple locations and speed that we varied over time. And if you do either of them, the performance doesn't change much on top of what we got without a curriculum. So they're all around like 40–45%. With the full thing, we got 100% in the first phase of the task. Right? Oh yeah, and sorry. Yeah, so this was just a toy or a schematic of the three things that you saw, but the full curriculum had more like, steps to it. And here are the learning curves. So at first you get like the static one gets somewhere like around 60% performance on the static task. And then you slowly go to faster and faster speeds or like lower periods. And then eventually you have the final task, which gets the 100% performance. So now task 2, like phase 2, was made extremely challenging. And there were a few things that made it like really hard. First, you do not only have one rotation, you had 3 tasks. So you had either clockwise movements, counterclockwise, or hold. And this looks like that. So here, there are 2 balls. Here are the targets. And this is clockwise. You have to move counterclockwise, or you just have to hold them in the place where the targets appear. Second, the rotation speed was randomized. It was not totally randomized, but it was uniformly drawn from an interval. And also the radius of the trajectory was randomized. And the most annoying thing about this curriculum was perhaps this. There's that the sizes of the balls, their masses, and the textures all varied. And the size difference was like pretty large, as you can see here. So mass difference was up to 10 times. So one could be like a ping pong ball and the other could be a stress ball. And the friction coefficient also varied by many orders of magnitude. And this was the other annoying thing about this phase 2, which was that the targets spawned randomly. So as you see here, this ball starts here, but the target is offset, and they spawn on totally opposite sides. So this introduces a kind of a decision-making problem at the beginning, where you have to decide if the balls are leading or lagging the targets. Do you accelerate them? Do you decelerate them? Do you go in the opposite direction, catch up with the targets, and then continue? So this is a fairly complex problem to solve. If you just have like a single like black box neural network and you throw it at that, it like almost like most of the existing algorithms, if you just train from scratch on it, they fail miserably. They all get 0. So yeah. Also, that on the bottom right is our solution from phase 1. That also doesn't quite generalize, but yeah, we used a similar approach. And so we use the same SDS curriculum as I showed earlier. So first, it's without the random physics. And by physics, I mean all the noise and the like balls and stuff. And the target initialization is also not random. And it also does not have the whole task. And this is largely because we trained anticipating what was going to happen in phase 2. And so here you see that we trained the same thing, slowly going to a shorter period, and then non-uniform, like, rotation period. And then eventually we add slight noisy physics, and then also slightly vary the angle, but basically use a similar SDS curriculum and to get to the final task. Right? And this by itself won the MyoChallenge. So it got like 54% performance out of 60 to 60%, 66 maximum based on a back of the envelope calculation. And finally, we added a couple of tricks to boost the performance a little bit further. So one was a hierarchical mixture of experts that I'm not going to talk about in interest of time. But this got on the official leaderboard 55% and got a little bit higher in our evaluations that we could not submit because we ran out at the end. And this had a task classifier and some specialized networks for the whole task, and then an ensemble of training checkpoints. So you combine all of this together and you run it and you get like a few percent boost. But again, this was not necessary to win the performance, just last things that we were trying. And for phase 2, we also did an ablation study and a performance benchmark. And you see that most of the other things don't really, so like parts of the curriculum individually don't really help, but the full thing gets 55%. And here are the final standings on the team. So the top 4 teams here. And yeah, I think that's it from my side. And thanks to all of you. And yeah, take any questions.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was very interesting to see how you solve such a difficult problem. Okay, so we may have time for a very quick question if we forget the break. So if you want a break, don't ask question. Otherwise, you can also always ask question on the chat.
I had one quick question. Can I go ahead?
Yep.
Yeah. So you did not modify the reward function, or I mean, from what I understood, you only introduced the curriculum.
We did. I mean, we used the alive reward, which was not by default like a part of the thing. But yeah.
Okay, you added an alive survival bonus, basically.
Yeah, like the balls would be allowed
Yeah.
for, yeah,
Okay.
but that was only in the beginning of the curriculum, not towards the end.
Okay.
If I remember correctly, yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. So I don't think we have time for the break. So maybe we can go for the second speakers. So the other team that won the rotation team, which is PQMAL. So that will be a team presentation from Yiran Gang and Boshi An. My Chinese is as good as my Dutch, so I hope I didn't butcher the name too much. So they are both undergraduate students from Peking University in China with a major in computer science, where they work in reinforcement learning and robotics. And their team co-won the dice rotation challenge. So if you can start sharing your screen, and then you can start your presentation.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen and hear you very well.
Okay. Hi everyone, I'm Yiran Geng. I will represent our team with my teammates Boshi An. We are junior students from Peking University. Today we are going to introduce our method and insight to the MyoChallenge die rotation task. Here's our team members. Our talk is divided into the following parts: introduction, our method, limitation, and future works. First, I will present some of the previous related work on dexterous hand. Before MyoSuite, much work was done using dexterous hand to accomplish a manipulation task. However, most dexterous hand tasks in this work are accomplished by direct control of joints. For example, the shadow hand, as shown in the upper left corner. The lower left figure shows the die rotation task completed by the ISRGN team, and the right side shows several more complex tasks with two dexterous hand completed by our team, such as lift support, open door, hand over, and open bottle cup, and the swing cup, open scissors. However, there's a big difference between controlling muscles and controlling joints. For example, if we apply a force to a joint, only one joint will move accordingly. But in this challenge, if we will apply a contraction force to a muscle, it will involve many joints. Moreover, MyoSuite's hand model also introduces the sarcopenia, muscle fatigue, and tendon transfer, which makes the task further difficult. What's more, the environment of the challenge incorporates many random parameters, including random initialization, random goal, as shown in table, and random physical properties of the object, such as object size and friction. So we need to train a policy that can accommodate such randomization, and we tried multiple methods to increase the success rate and minimize the force applied to the muscle. Okay, the rest part will be presented by my teammate Boshi An.
Hey, can you hear me?
Okay.
Yeah. So let us move on to the methods adopted in our final submission. In a word, we use the traditional reinforced learning framework to train our policy. In the training, we adopted the reward shaping, curriculum learning, and multi-target training to improve the performance of the trained policy. Those methods together produce a significant improvement in the success rate over the baselines given in the MyoSuite. Next, I will introduce the details of our four methods. For the reinforced learning framework, we use natural policy gradients, NPG, to train our policy. And we also observed similar performance reached by other algorithms, for example, the policy approximate policy gradient, PPO. The network under our policy is quite simple. The policy network only consists of a MLP, which has only 2 hidden layers, and each is 64 size. And while the value function has also a similar size. Here we can explain the efficiency achieved by such a simple network from a biological perspective. The human cerebellum, which is mainly responsible for the precise movement control and motor learning, consists of a similar structure as an MLP. There are only in total 3 layers of neurons, the mossy fiber, the granule cell, and the Purkinje cell. Each layer only has connections toward neurons in the next layer. So the biological structure indicates that simple networks can have excellent efficiency if it is fine-tuned. However, since the learning mechanism of the human cerebellum is still a mystery, and we have yet to learn how human obtains such precise and dexterous motor ability with such simple structures in the cerebellum. So in the challenge, without further inspirations from the human brain, we can only do them ourselves to train the policy network by the following 3 methods. The first method is reward shaping. Let us take a quick review of the success criteria of the die rotation task. The distance between the die and the target should be in a specific range, and the rotational arrow should also be small enough. In RL settings, reinforcement learning, reward signals are essential. A more reasonable dense reward can accelerate the overall training and lead to better policies. The original dense reward given by the Myo suite is reasonable, but it is not dense enough, which means it cannot directly use to train policies. So we followed our intuition in manipulating objects to implement a better reward signal that proposed the following reward terms. The first term is RD. RD is a term encouraging the fingers to touch the object to perform delicate manipulation. RR is used to make the agent align the object's rotation to the targets. RX is a term encouraging the agent to move the object to the target location. So the final reward function is the sum of the 3 terms plus some penalties for action and live, some addition to lives. In our experiments, we found that the limit on rotational arrow is the most difficult to meet. So our reward term for rotational arrow is a unimodal function with its peak on the target rotation. The reward shaping method itself improved the success rate to 42% in phase 1. The second method is curriculum learning. Before explaining this method, we should go through some properties we found in the experiments. First, generally speaking, the difficulty of a task is positively related to the size of the state base, which consists of both observations and some randomizations. Second, less randomization and shorter episode length usually result in faster training, but lower performance in the original task. Third, when the learning rate of the value function is much greater than the policy networks, slightly adjusting the reward function during the training process will not cause the policy to fail. So using the 3 properties, we can design a curriculum learning sequence for our policy. The policy will be trained in an environment that is gradually getting more randomized, and the episode learned is getting longer. And we will also modify the reward functions from the initial dense reward to a final reward that is relatively sparse, letting the agent to focus on finishing the goal. So here is the reward curve during the whole training process. Every discontinuity point has resulted from the update of the reward. The curriculum learning method along with the reward shaping technique has improved the success rate in phase 1 to 71%. However, it is still challenging for a single policy to handle rotations greater than 90 degrees, even with the above mentioned techniques. The reason is that rotation within 90 degrees can be done with a single move, like in the phase 1. But a 180-degree rotation needs at least 2 moves, according to our intuition and some results in our experiments. The video shows several failures of our method in handling large rotations. Perhaps the video isn't working. So I will go through. We attempted to solve the large rotation problem by adopting the third technique, the multi-target training. The target of manipulation will be updated after each success. It is worth noting that new target is within reach range of the 90-degree rotation from the old target, and which means the agent is allowed to learn a policy that can only handle small rotations within 90 degrees. But the training process will help the agent to perform consecutive rotations to form a large rotation. So theoretically, this will help the agent to solve the large rotation problem without learning more policies. Unfortunately, our agent did not perform as well as we expected during the multi-target training. So finally, we had to focus on reaching a high success rate for rotations within 90 degrees and give up those large rotations in phase 2, and resulting in an 11 or 12% success rate in phase 2. Here, the limitation of our solutions to the MyoChallenge is obvious. We still cannot produce a policy that can perform well to large rotations. The reason is that the agent cannot propose different number of movements for different angles. So it cannot support large rotation. We speculate that the curriculum learning process may have limited ability of proposing multiple movements, since in the early stage of the curriculum, single move manipulation is enough to achieve the goal, and the policy tends to be inherited by the later stage of the curriculum. In our future research, we're hopeful that manipulation policy can behave more like animals, both in the accuracy and the diversity in locomotion modes. In the left video, you can see that our current policy failed to show different locomotion modes for different rotation angles, which result in failure of large rotations, while the right video shows even a decerebrated cat can exhibit multiple gaits in different speed. Here are some realistic ideas that may be worth looking into first. We can construct a mechanism that combines multiple policy networks, just as the Steve Fingers team, while the networks can be separately trained in the different states, resulting in diverse behaviors. Second, we can increase the parallelism to provide more samples for training. In the challenge, we cannot massively parallelize the environment efficiently. The highest FPS frame per second we get is on a 32-core personal computer, which is designed for gaming, and we can only have 64 parallel environments, while using a 256-core server will reduce the overall performance. By using better multi-threading technologies, I think we may be able to fully release the power of parallelism and increase the sample efficiency, thus result in better policies. Finally, we hope more researchers can join in the community of dexterous manipulation, contributing to from different perspectives. And you can access our code in the GitHub repo or contact us via email and our website. Thank you. And if you have questions.
Thanks. Very nice presentation. So if you have any question, we have a couple of minutes.
I had a question. Like I thought like your repository was about multi-agent RL, but I didn't hear you mention anything about using multi-agent RL. Do you use multi-agent?
Multi-agent RL is only the name of our team, so we didn't use multi-agent RL in the task.
Okay. Well, it would have been an interesting thing to try, because definitely like using multiple agents for different actions might kind of subdivide the action space rather than just the task space, which the curriculum does. So I find that could be an interesting avenue to explore. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you.
Nishit, you have a question?
Yeah, I had a quick question, if you know. So I was curious what if you used a curriculum also for the rotations, and in terms of what, because there are many trajectories that would give you the same final rotation, right? So could you expand a bit more on your curriculum for that? Thanks.
Our curriculum consists of the angle range, which is increased from 90 degrees to 180 degrees, and some other randomizations, and along with the episode length. So we have 3 factors of curriculum.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. Now we can go to the next presentation. So the next presentation is from Raoul. That's also co-won the die rotation task. So Raoul is currently a research fellow at the Institute of Advanced Research in Artificial Intelligence in Vienna, where he's supervised by Professor Sepp Oschreiter and Dr. Michael Kopp. So while his current work focused on generalization in curriculum learning, he's also interested in application of computer vision and geometric deep learning. So as I say, his team was also the co-winner of the die rotation challenge. So Raoul, if you want to start.
Thanks a lot for the introduction. I hope everyone can hear me. And you can also see the slides fully. You can see the logos as well fully.
We can see your slide, but we also see your browser, part of your browser.
Okay, well, that shouldn't be a problem as long as you can see the slides fully.
Okay.
Okay, so hello, everyone. I'll be talking about our winning solution for the die rotate task. Thanks, first of all, to the organizers for hosting such an excellent, interesting challenge. And thanks also in particular to Sepp and Michael for their support. So just for some context, so we had our, we recently published a paper at the DRL workshop, which is on Friday, which is basically about online distillation with informative rewards. Improves generalization in curriculum learning. And we wanted, like basically the experiments in our paper dealt with discrete environments, but we were looking for some continuous environments where we could see if our method really works, like does it generalize to continuous environments as well. And turned out, like we found out about the MyoChallenge competition, like almost 3 weeks before it was supposed to end. And we decided, okay, let's just give it a try to see if our method really does work, even in continuous control tasks. And turns out it does work. So yeah, really glad. So yeah, please do visit our poster session for further information about our paper. So now coming to the overview. So first I'll talk about the general motivation for our idea, and then some preliminaries. And then I'll discuss the actual methodology we used, which is basically we minimize task irrelevant exploration. And there are 3 steps to this. And finally, we'll talk about the EvoTorch baseline. Because we had very limited time, we just went with the existing baseline that was already published. And then I'll talk about the compute setup, and finally the results and future outlook and acknowledgements. So this is basically our motivation for this approach. So you can see that curriculum learning is essential to human learning, and you can see this on the figure on the right. And basically, if you have a complicated task like the high jump, you know, the exploration is hard, and that's basically what this figure suggests, because you never had one person discover the final well, you don't know if it's optimal, but the final technique for the high jump. It always took like multiple generations. So it's like you have a curriculum that spans generations. And basically, in short, exploration in high-dimensional spaces is challenging, and how can we replicate this success in our setting? So just to talk about the preliminary, so we model the problem as an MDP. You have a state space, an action space, a reward function, and transition probabilities, and then finally a distribution of initial states. Here we consider gamma as 1 because we have finite episode lengths. So the idea is that the states visited by the optimal policy are a very small percentage of the actual state space. So we represent this here as the state space is a union of this irrelevant states and relevant states, where relevant states are these states relevant for the optimal policy. And usually the cardinality of the relevant states is much, much less than the irrelevant states. So the idea is that you want to minimize task irrelevant exploration. And clearly, I mean, if you're visiting all of these irrelevant states and your policy is learning something from them, you also have capacity issues. So this is the way we try to tackle this problem. So this is what our method tries to do. So we use informative rewards to minimize this task irrelevant exploration. And the idea behind an informative so basically, the idea behind the informative rewards is that you have a reward function like this, which is represented as a difference fi t plus 1 minus st. So it's a difference of 2 consecutive states. And the idea is that if this function represents like a distance to the goal, like how close you are to the goal. So you can see on the bottom right, so you have this grid world environment where this red triangle has to reach the green square. And on the right, you can see like proximity to the goal. And when you take these differences, you get a positive reward when you move towards the goal, i.e. when you make progress, and negative when you move away. So this is what we mean by an informative reward. And once you have an informative reward, I guess the idea is clear that you avoid visiting states that are irrelevant to the task because you're immediately negatively rewarded, right? So this was the basic idea, but now how do we apply it to this die rotate task, right? So we unfortunately did not have time to apply our full method. We just could only apply parts of it, which was we tried to minimize task irrelevant exploration basically by using a curriculum to subdivide the state space. And then we used a potential based shaping function. So we take this difference of 2 consecutive states, which helps us avoid a lot of the problems with conventional dense rewards. Like I think Nishit mentioned, like you have these issues where it can just decide to terminate the episode instead of solving the task. And finally, early episode termination. I think this was also used by the previous solution. And basically implementing these 3 things was sufficient to help us achieve the score of 0.13 with a pretty low effort. So to talk about our first approach, which is using curricula. So the idea is pretty general. What we wanted to do here is that we assume that you have your row 0, which is your starting state distribution. So here the die can start like very far away from the goal or close to the goal, right? And essentially we create like the subsets of this starting state distribution, where row 1 is like the first state where the die is initialized only like 0.2 radians away from the goal. And then row 2, it's like initialized 0.3 radians away from the goal, and so on. So you have this increasing distances from the goal. And the idea of doing this is simply that if the goal is nearby, it's likely to not visit irrelevant states because it's more likely to find the goal, right? So in a sense, this was one of the main things that minimizes task irrelevant exploration. Then moving to the second thing. So the second aspect was we wanted to use an informative reward, but we didn't have enough time to learn an informative reward. Ideally, we should have. I think that's something that we're planning to do. But we ended up just using a potential-based shaping function. So you have a potential function based on the distance. So you can just take the sum of the rotational and translational distances, and this just gives you a potential function because there are no cycles in it, like you can't go in a cycle and then you get back to the same value. So basically, if you take differences, you'll get a difference of 0. So basically, now you take the difference of this function, and this gives you like a pseudo informative reward. And the reason this is not an informative reward is because there are situations where, for example, if you rotate the die, like you want to do 180 degrees, but you did 90, and then your hand is like stuck there, because to get it beyond 90, you need to like get back your hand to a normal position and then try again. But getting back, like you need to move away from the goal. So yeah, that's basically why this reward is not ideal, but it works so far. So the main advantages is that it avoids these spurious episode termination issues, because you always have a positive reward no matter where in the state space you are. So there is no issue of balancing rewards. And finally, the one problem that it does is that yeah, so the other advantage is that because any state which takes you further away from the goal like is immediately negatively rewarded. So it's unlikely to spend time in such states and then learn things about those states. So the feature representations learned by the neural networks are like focused on the most important, the relevant states. And finally, the third thing is that in the original environment was designed to terminate 20 centimeters. So when the die goes 20 centimeters away from the hand, it terminates. But assuming that the optimal policy here is not to like toss the die up and then catch it in the right orientation, we decided to just terminate it like 5 centimeters away. So this avoids learning when the die is like far away from the hand. So, and just a brief briefly about the EvoTorch baseline. So the EvoTorch baseline uses PGPE, which is basically neuroevolution. So you have a population of 20,000 agents, and in our case, to implement the curriculum, we used 256 environments, so a population of 256 environments, where each environment adapts its curriculum based on a success percentage that the agent achieves, right? So this 20,000 agents is distributed among these 256 environments. And then if within 20 successive trials, if they achieve a success threshold of like 85%, then that one environment will increase its, it'll step the curriculum to the next level. So this is like you have an adaptive curriculum distribution based on the performance of the agent. And yeah, finally, we just used the clip-up optimizer, and we did not change any of the hyperparameters from the baseline. We just left them as they were. And to talk about the compute setup, so I think this was especially important because we had very limited time, and we didn't have any, barely any time to optimize any of the hyperparameters. So basically, what we used was we had Terraform and then OpenStack on top of it, and EvoTorch luckily came with a Ray integration. So we had like these 64 CPU machines. We had a Ray cluster running on them, and then so we had this 256 environments, yeah, as 256 processes. And to finally summarize our results, so we trained for around 4,000 generations. And just a short note on the policy. So the policy was like 22,000 parameters. So it was a 2-layer RNN, again, because it was partially observable. And essentially 4,000 generations, like 12 billion samples, but it more or less converges around 3 billion, and the improvements beyond that are kind of limited. And clearly, I think the previous team pointed out that you to go beyond 90 degrees, you needed to learn kind of these 2-step policies. And that is something that even we fail at the same aspect. And I think that if we do the distillation, if we actually learn an informative reward and do the distillation, which I think we'll describe on our poster. So I think that should work, and we're currently working on it. So hopefully we'll have it out soon. So just to summarize the future outlook, so I already mentioned that we're trying to learn this informative reward and then do a distillation. And then the other aspect is we can use better policy architectures that can do better with, like, in these multitask settings. And finally, a note on reproducibility. So we felt that sometimes there is too much focus placed on reproducibility, but then you get reproducibility at the cost of having some unexplained hyperparameters in your method. And then these unexplained hyperparameters do not generalize to other settings. So at the moment, what we implemented, it's not perfectly reproducible, but like there is some variance, and the results usually lie within that. And another note on sample efficiency. So our method does not assume any RL algorithm in particular. It could be neuroevolution. You can use PPO as well. But the point is that PGP, because it needs full episodes, it's a couple of orders of magnitude. I mean, it could be more efficient if you just use PPO, for example. And that is something that we will also try. And on the right is just one of the policies for the bounding balls that a similar method learns. Basically, it's just the same thing. We just change row 0, what it means. So it's basically the same method. And yeah, finally, please visit our poster session. And yeah, thank you all for listening.
Thanks, Raul, for the talk. Very interesting. I'm kind of curious to see if in the future we can solve this issue of doing multiple movements to go beyond 90 degrees. So the same problem as previous team also had. Okay, so if you have a question. Okay, so then if there is no more question, we can now go to the panel discussion. So for the panel discussion, it will be composed of all the speaker, as well as Vittorio Caggiano. So Vittorio is one of the main developer of MyoSuit, also one of the main organizer of the MyoChallenge. So Vittorio obtained his PhD at the Max Planck Institute in the University in Tübingen in Germany. He was then a postdoc at MIT in the US. Then he went back to the University of Tübingen for a postdoc, and then finally ended up for the last postdoc at the Karolinska Institute in Sweden. He then went on to work at IBM, and he's now working at Meta AI, and his research focused on so machine learning, but also neuroscience and signal processing. He won the best graduate student paper presentation in the field of motor control at EGS 2005, the Aptento Prize from the University of Tübingen, the Fodder Prize, and he was also a Focus Magazine Person of the Month. And he also obtained a long-term fellowship from the Human Frontier Science program. Okay. So for the panel discussion, we prepare some questions, but also if the audience have some questions, they can write it in the chat, or they can put down their hand and ask a question. And also, if we have time and if there is some more question on one of the talk that was presented, we can also take a little bit of time for that. Okay. So my first question, so it's it's a little bit more on the biomechanic field, which I'm from. And in the biomechanic field, to control and to reproduce neural control on biomechanics, and that was presented in the talk of Wendy, we mostly use optimal control and optimization to kind of represent this neural control. So my question to the panel would be, what can machine learning bring to biomechanics? So on the focus on reproducing the neural control. So what was presented by Alexander, that optimization, optimal control cannot do.
I guess I'll start by contributing that I don't necessarily think that biomechanics requires optimization, but it is definitely where biomechanics started. And to me, it feels like the ability to use different control is going to be very important. I think people have understood and believed that optimization has a lot of limitations, but it is kind of it's the entry point and the most accessible as is. So I think the integration of machine learning and other control possibilities with biomechanics is really important.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that optimization is like, yes, the point of entry in biomechanics. So for example, OpenSim, like, which is the main software used for biomechanics. Nowadays, most of the tool to represent neural control is based on optimization, so static optimization, CMC, and there is not really a tool right now that integrates machine learning with biomechanic models. So that's why we went on to develop MyoSuits, because it's really like the merging of biomechanic model, so fast biomechanical model, and machine learning. And that was also presented in the talk of Thomas, that yeah, for machine learning you need fast model, because if you need to train reinforcement learning when you have a million of steps, or what was presented also in the talk of the winner of the competition, where they train a million of steps, or even billion for the last presentation, you really need really fast model.
Yeah, I mean, I think the speed of simulation problem is a big one. But again, I don't necessarily think that there's no way to do machine learning with OpenSim, you know, with the API, and you can implement code in MATLAB or through the API in Python. The issue is just whether I think there's ways that OpenSim has tried to be faster, but obviously, you know, for the upper limb and control for that, the interface with the environment is not optimized. But in general, I don't think of the tools available in OpenSim as limiting in that they're the only way to do it. It's just that you have to be a person that is willing to work to implement the code. And then I do think, you know, some of the way the constraints are handled, the simulations, you could do everything, but it would take a long time.
Yeah, so maybe I can add something, because there actually is a little bit of something in between the machine learning research and the inverse optimizations that biomechanics used. That's more like a evolutionary strategy based approach, where you optimize a very simple controller with about something like 100 parameters, and you try to optimize that for a specific goal. Like, for instance, the Geyer and Her controller for gait is a very good example of that. And that really fits like in between like the inverse optimizations and the really extreme machine learning optimizations. And that's basically where I come from and where I've been using OpenSim, and it works reasonably well for that, although at some point you do get limited by the simulation speed. And to answer the question of what machine learning can bring is the main advantage that I noticed is that if you use these simple Geyer-Hur-like controllers, then you can get great results for specific tasks, but they don't really generalize very well to external perturbations or really complex deviations from that task. While machine learning is just amazing in that sense. It doesn't do as well yet at creating very natural motions or natural activation patterns, but it's really amazing at how well it can handle perturbations or different situations. So it generalizes much better. It scales much better, basically, than these other tasks.
Speaking of natural looking patterns, one of the things and one of the reasons why our team name is Stiff Fingers is that we noticed like the tendency of like the fingers being very like, you know, stiff in the myosuit, right? They always go like flat. And it seems like compared to the natural like movement of, if I just leave my hand normally, like when I'm sleeping, probably it looks like that, right? Are there no, in the myosuit, are there no like I guess natural positions for muscles to be in? Because if you leave them untouched, they and could they be or are they planned to be implemented in the future?
Okay, let me take this. So there is a tendency when you have muscle control and you experience this, you can get the same position in different ways. And in particular, what often happens is that the control for intrinsic muscle of the hands is simpler because they span less joints than extrinsic muscle. And the stiff fingers that you're observing very likely is due to the use of intrinsic muscle. Now, this is not what you normally do because we have less strength, but optimizing for some of the properties in solving those tasks, we really don't generalize to all the other tasks that we can solve. So that my easier interpretation of that. You'll get more complex pattern like other teams have when you start enforcing the use of the old dynamics of the joints of the hand. So from that standpoint, is not. I mean, is just a optimization that solution that you find that had that was exploiting more that. And just to also ask your answer your question about the so the hand has a resting position where there is an optimal length of the muscle that is included. That is what you will do. What will happen if you just let the model without any muscle activation? There will be a tendency of the hand to fall, just gravity, because from that optimal position by gravity, depending on the posture that you impose, then the muscle will just not be have enough strength to sustain the hand. And that will be what you will observe, for example, for a person that has pass outs or has sudden loss of muscle tone, that will just go all the muscle flaccid and will just fall down.
Thanks.
Okay, so maybe we can pass to your second question. That's maybe.
Can I ask a quick question about the
Yes.
challenge? It didn't involve the wrist, did it? Or was the wrist in a constant posture, or what was the wrist allowed to move?
Which was allowed to move was in a free state. So the team had actually all the flexibility to rotate and change the posture. One thing though that there is some limitation in the type of movements that you can do because as you well know, there are not, some muscles are missing. There are, for example, the brachioradialis, that is very important to compensate some of the wrist rotation. So there were, in principle, all range of movement was allowed to happen, but there are some that were basically more difficult to explore.
Okay. So my second question, and that maybe this question will be more for Alexander, is on what biomechanics and neuroscience can bring to machine learning. So I think that was very interesting in your presentation. Or you can directly look at the human is doing movement to then learn from it.
Right. I mean, so what can biomechanics and neuroscience bring to ML? I mean, I think one thing that is interesting about animals, now it's basically the only living proof of intelligence out there that we have, because AI lacks it quite a bit. And so ultimately, I think what we can get from biology is well, a lot of inspiration for actually creating really interesting artificial intelligence systems, or let's say more interesting than the ones that we have already. And if we look at kind of skills in particular, I would say for cognitive skills, artificial intelligence systems have actually really achieved or surpassed human skills, let's say playing chess or playing Go or computing even. But as you guys all know, for sensory motor tasks, that's really not the case. Like animals are extremely agile, and in comparison, robots cannot match that kind of agility at all. And so I think there's a lot we can learn from biomechanics and from neuroscience in order to improve machine learning and control.
Alex, if I could ask another question on the same lines, is do you think we could also learn, so animals are like incredibly efficient, like as Thomas showed in his talk, like you just need very few things if the muscles are configured correctly to, like, you know, walk or jump or do whatever, right? And those are very complicated movements if you have to learn from scratch with an ML algorithm. Do you think we could like sufficiently constraining neural like artificial neural architectures is something that could be extracted from like learned machine learning policies that you can then, like, you know, it's basically caching like some biases in your architecture that are useful to constrain movements in, like, you know, some direction, and they this helps like greatly speed up learning, so you have to learn very little. And do you think that is also something that could go from, let's say, biomechanics and neuroscience to machine learning?
For me, we're cutting out a, or maybe that is on my end. Yes. So I think the biomechanics aspect was really, I mean, I think neuroscience really needs biomechanics, no? As we saw very beautifully, I think in Thomas and Wendy's talk, because if you're trying to control the wrong plant, then the controller, which is, in other words, for example, the brain that you infer is not related to the actual kind of controller that is in place. And so, in other words, we need to have really good understanding of the plants in order to understand how the brain actually does its job. So I would say that's a key aspect. I'm not sure I answered your question, which I only heard, I don't know, 50% or something.
Maybe we can take it offline, because for me, you were also cutting quite a bit. So
sorry.
Maybe I can also try to answer. So that's a part of a discussion that I had with Vittorio on taking just like an empty neural network and looking at a human. So like human, when you're born, you have some pre-connection that are established that kind of guide your learning. So you're not born with like a bunch of neurons that just connect like randomly to your spinal cord and then to your muscle. You are kind of guided on all this connection, are done. So if you look at reflex, so every human have reflex. So it's not something that's emerged by learning. So I think what we can learn from the human, it's at least the biology on all these connections. So it's not really a connection, but all of these muscle and spinal cord are connected, and also the hierarchy of first like the central nervous system, and then you have your spinal cord, and then your muscle. And it's in one of the presentation of one of the team winner, there was this video of the decerebrated cat. When so it's a very famous experiment where you basically have a cat where his brain is not connected to the spinal cord anymore. So it's basically just the spinal cord driving the muscle. And you can see that just by using reflexes like proprioception, the cat is still able to work and also to change speed. So it's something that I think we can learn if we want to do at least machine learning algorithms that can control human, or at least reproduce human control level.
Yeah, I think that's actually a very important observation, that in machine learning, it's just a standard that you have like a bunch of inputs and then like a set of hidden layers and a bunch of outputs. But neural systems don't work like that at all in biology. It's just there's direct connection, and on top of that, there's a hierarchy. It's really built completely different, and the choice for the like all the hidden layers is actually quite arbitrarily. So it would be really interesting if the machine learning research would focus more on different architectures that match biology better, and also apply the same algorithms, because you can still use backpropagation on those algorithms as well, I think. So be a very interesting thing to research.
Well, just one note on this. I think that we definitely, I mean, the architecture and neural connection that are the base of reflexes and other physiological structure, they are there, and they're part of how we born and how our central nervous system initiate their operation. But there is a lot of changes that also happen through learning, a lot of plasticity that happens in our central nervous system that needs to be modeled. Now, this points completely against classic artificial neural network models, but at the same time, machine learning is much richer than deep learning. It's not only what we are using right now that has been method that have worked pretty well for the classic problem that we have been facing. So this is more, for me, is an incentive to look out of the box to new ways to approach the problem, to look for new solutions that are not just some static solution that we can use optimize to solve one specific task, but more things that go in the direction of lifelong learning, things that learn and adapt throughout the life like we do. We don't forget how to move. We build knowledge, we build understanding, and then we extract from basic knowledge how to faster learn new solution, and we are stable to other variation along the way. So this is, for me, is like more the motivation to look into machine learning for the future through going beyond the classic, well, now it's classic deep learning, but I mean, deep learning methods.
Yeah, I agree with all of this, but there's like, for me, one key part that is missing, at least for motor control, which is you have like, so for the visual systems, let's say you have very good abstractions, right? You have the retina-based convolutions that you can like stack on top, and that gives you like, things in a nice hierarchical fashion. But like when it comes to actions, there's an abstraction in time that is kind of missing in machine learning, right? So you have even in the cat example that we were talking about, there's the central pattern generator, and their higher level input only goes in terms of maybe making it faster or slower if the spinal cord was not cut off or damaged, I guess. But and that is a different level of input than the other hierarchical nets that we are more familiar with in deep learning. And building this it's like completely unsolved as far as I know, unless you know some resources, maybe that would be helpful.
If the question was to me, actually, I mean, this can be very easily modeled. I mean, the alternation of the contribution of central part generators can be modeled through a recurrent excitatory inhibitory network. So at the high level, we have some mechanistic understanding how the circuit might work based on the experimental modeling work. The problem is to make that make that at the level of execution and making a machinery or a model that is able to execute through the variability. That's the difficult part, because it's not just how to trigger those movements, how to trigger the variability of the alternation between limbs or the quadruped parts, but is how to make that reliable to all the reflexes and all the tasks that we want to put on the top. So those modeling, for example, are very well. I mean, they are understood by the level of more in vitro models, where you have a completely just a circuit that you look at. And this is very difficult to put into practice, because when you talk about the sensory system, you can model that, and Alexander has covered this beautifully, as feed-forward network. You have an input, you took the output. Sensory system, when you start looking into proprioception, change over time because the movements are happening. So you start getting into loops. So when we move into sensory motor system, and the integration is continuous change. So the type of integration needs to change, and is definitely much more challenging to make it stable and reliable over time.
Yeah, maybe I just want maybe drop a very bold question. So I just Googled that for human, we have 86 billion neurons. Does this information mean that if we have a large enough neural network with this much of parameters, we don't even need to care about the structure? We can just make it work for any moment. Is that true?
We have also 10% of the synapses, or 5% of the synapses that change every day. So connection, and we have excitatory and inhibitory neurons. If you can model all those, maybe, but maybe Alexander has a different view as a neuroscientist and wants to chime in.
Well, it's more than just the connections. No, it's I mean, hierarchy matters, I would say, for sure, and I think as that touches upon what was earlier said, it's actually of great interest to understand kind of hierarchy in sensory motor systems, and let's say also better inductive biases of biological systems to make better control. I think, yeah. Like the architecture is quite interesting.
I think it's hard to think about controlling a system where structure and function aren't related. You know, like the idea is like, could we make a big enough network that we could just control whatever? But I feel like a fundamental part of how we move, you know, there's a lot of talk of neuromechanics. Like part of how we move has to do with the structure and function of our system. It's why there's been benefit to me and my career in studying the plant, like, because the control of the system, there are different ways that the way muscle works or how muscles are attached to the skeleton really affects how you move. And so I guess you could have enough computational power to just mimic the motion. But I think if you want to actually control human movement or animal movement or understand that control, the structure function relationship from biology, whether it's nervous system, musculoskeletal system, or the crossing of both of those is going to have to be incorporated. I feel like if you just have a artificial intelligence or machine learning or deep learning approach and just say someday we'll have the computational power, you'll just be mimicking as opposed to really developing a control system that is telling you something. You know, even the results we have from the optimal control theory, like we generate big enough grip forces and we are distributing the forces across the fingers in a way, but it's not quite what muscle activations people chose during an experiment. So there's something in there to learn about what the system is controlling and why. And I think that's embedded in the structure function relationship, how the experiment was constrained versus how we constrained the simulation. And I think that plays a role in really what we're going to understand in the long run. Does that make sense?
And I also think it's not really fair to use the number of neurons in a human as a baseline, because there's a lot of animals that have much less neurons that move much more efficiently than many AI systems. So there's really something to learn from that as well.
Yeah, but efficient also means simplified, right? So you have less movement patterns, and like in the animals with less neurons. To be
Yes,
efficient.
exactly. Yeah. Yes. Well, it just shows that there's a lot more to the whole control system and the biology behind it than what humans can do.
Yeah, yeah, I do agree with that part. I'm just curious, like, is the structural stuff also constrains our ability doing movement? Like, yeah,
It's
like
maybe that's because we're not using it in the right way, or we're not using the right structure. I would say it's more interesting to find out what the structure would be so that it would be more efficient.
Yeah, this question can go very wild, but
yeah,
it's better to stop, right?
I just had one point I want to address about the hierarchy. Like, I feel that perhaps we already have these solutions, like because recurrent networks already have the capacity for this temporal hierarchy, because you can have some units in your recurrent network which have higher frequency, like the memory cell. Some memory cells change at high frequency, some at lower frequencies. So technically, in theory, the recurrent networks are capable of already exhibiting this temporal hierarchies. But I guess the problem is that you're adding these networks to an already optimized system, like you're imitating this human structure with muscles and bones, and then suddenly you have this untrained recurrent network that is connected, wired up to this, and then optimizing this system can now become really hard, because you have on the one side an optimized human body, and then you have this completely like randomly initialized RNN. And perhaps if we, I don't know, optimize the body structure along with the network, that might help make the optimization task easier for the network. So perhaps, I mean, a direction could be like having the MyoSuit environment itself optimizable, perhaps. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, that's quite an interesting point. I think it's also linked to what Thomas mentioned about the delay, right? So the delay, actually, human use the delay to generate a good timing of the TA activation. I think that's kind of maybe the co-evolution between the structures and also neural controls.
yes, that's definitely something that happens, and it's also something that's really poorly understood right now, also in biomechanics research.
Okay, so I think our time is up, and it's getting quite late right now in Europe, and people have to go to work tomorrow morning. So I think we can close the session. So yeah, so I just want to thank all the speakers, also the team that could join. I really enjoyed the talk. I think everybody enjoyed the talk. It was quite a broad range of talk. So from Thomas, Wendy, Alexander, and Alessandro, I think we went towards a broad interest in neuroscience, biomechanics, and ML community, which was very interesting. And I also really enjoyed the discussion at the end, which I think could continue for a couple of hours more. But yeah, people have to go to sleep now. So thank you very much for joining. I hope to see you all next year for the next iteration of the MyoChallenge. We hope to make possible. We will be thinking about new tasks and challenge. So if you also have some idea of a new task that you would like to see in the next iteration of the MyoChallenge, just send us an email or tweet, DM at us, because we are preparing some new tasks. So we were looking at the lower limb. We are thinking also looking at bimanual task. So if something that's it would be interesting for you, just contact us. And finally, I'm very also curious to see, because some of the team are still working on the current MyoChallenge task. So I'm also curious to see how far they can go right now. Okay, so thank you very much, and see you next time.
Thanks a lot to the organizers. This was an amazing challenge. I forgot to mention that during the talk, but yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Participating both for the challenge and at the workshop. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you very much.